Good morning, everybody. I would like to welcome you, and I'm very glad that there are so many different organizations represented and entities as well as companies, operators. So this speaks for the fact that we indeed have a very timely moment here now to discuss the topic that is everywhere, as you can see. So we really hit the point in time. And we want to deal with the Green Deal, Clean Energy Package, and what is CER's role in this, and the CER priority, which in fact for this year is decarbonization. So, as you know, the Green Deal has the ambition, is a very ambitious plan to make Europe climate neutral by 2050. And cutting emissions, of course, energy efficiency first, have R&D, innovation, decarbonize all sectors, not only the energy sector, and all actors, so business, cities, communities, citizens, of course, consumers, and all the measures with regard to this effort. So still, energy accounts for 75% of the greenhouse gas emissions. But the Green Deal, as I just mentioned, in fact, recognizes that decarbonization needs to not only cover energy, but all sectors, and get a coherent approach to the decarbonization also for the transport sector, mobility, building sector in particular as well, and other sectors as agriculture, etc. So I think that is very important to recognize. And we see, for example, that the ETS, which is applicable only in the energy area, is showing first signs of success. Greenhouse gas emissions do get, or the certificates for them do get more expensive, and so we see that the measures finally start to work. So we, as energy regulators, see that the Green Deal is of high relevance for our work, because already before we published a paper, the Glass Bridge paper, which Clara Poletti, the chair of the ACER Board of Regulators, will explain in more detail in a minute. But we, of course, also see that the Green Deal goes beyond gas, as I just mentioned, and, for example, is building on the Clean Energy Package, which also is a priority for us. And in particular, we want to promote flexibility, functioning markets, and in order to integrate renewables both into the grid as well as into the market, so to make the system, the whole system, work well and work in the direction to achieve these ambitious objectives. That is also reflected in our 2020 work program, which we published earlier this month, and which sees besides the decarbonization objective and the energy transition, the implementation of the Clean Energy Package. And we have let's say we have organized our work program along our 3D strategy. You know what the 3Ds are: the digitalization, on which we published a paper last year, decarbonization at least cost, and I will explain in a moment what this means, and dynamic regulation. And this year, as I said, is focusing on the decarbonization at least costs. We want here to produce a report on decarbonization at least cost, trying to explain this, so that we are not just looking at decarbonization per se, but that we try to implement an electricity market design that produces efficient price signals, which then ensures that the cost of the transition are minimal and are fairly distributed on consumers as well as on business, and that not only one side bears all the cost, and that we are also not leaving anyone behind in this transition. So that is what we think what is very important. And as we also said several times, we think for this it is important to have a whole system approach, so to optimize the whole energy system to achieve these objectives, and taking into account both gas and electricity. And that is very important, to look more on the side of the sector coupling, or as it is now always also called, sector integration. And I think that is maybe more reflecting what needs to be done to achieve a whole system approach and to achieve a clean energy system in that sense. As we know already in the clean energy package, the consumer, and more particular the active consumer, is in the focus, and therefore as regulators we always work for the benefit of consumers, and we want to implement this, the measures that can or that enable and empower consumers to be active and to participate actively in the system, in the wholesale as well as, of course, in the retail markets, as active consumers, prosumers, etc., so that they can then also benefit from the efficiency gains more directly, and on the other side can also, of course, contribute, for example, to more grid stability in that sense. So I think that is an important part, and of course this requires creating the consumer and ensuring consumer confidence in order to be able for them to also, let's say, take up these the new possibilities and become more active, because as we know, consumers are sometimes, let's say, slow to react, and I think if they want to benefit, we need to ensure that they are confident that the system works, so that they in the end can reap the benefits. An important part, of course, of the Green Deal is are the renewables, and we already publish regularly a status review of renewable support schemes, and we continue to do this also this year, and also to look in detail on the subsidies. But of course we are aware of the fact that the renewables are becoming or are already in some instances competitive, and therefore the idea, of course, also implemented in the clean energy package is clearly to phase out subsidies, or to reduce them at least to a minimal level. Again, this is in the sense of energy, of making the system more efficient and greener. So that's what we have on the renewable side, and we will publish also we are working already on a discussion paper on how can the market facilitate the energy transition towards more renewables. So that is what I just mentioned, making the mechanisms more efficient, and in that sense then supporting the energy transition for both consumers and the system as a whole. Together with ACER, we will have follow-up work on the gas bridge beyond 2025, and the recommendations, fill them with more, let's say, put more flesh on the bones, and Clara will mention in more detail what we are envisaging in that regard, and how this fits into the broader topic of the Green Deal. We know that some integration of electricity and gas is already in place, but we also know that it is likely to be more important, and to go beyond what is currently in place in order to achieve the decarbonization objectives that we have just mentioned, like power to X, or power to several things, and there is a lot of innovation in that area underway, and of course the perspective of the regulator is always on how to ensure that this works also from the regulatory perspective, because we should not forget where we come from, regulating the grid, but as it is interacting more and more, and we need to ensure that the new business models fit into a regulated market. or regulated sector, let me say. Also, together with ACER, we will continue our monitoring. You know, last year we also presented jointly the various reports. So we are working here, providing transparency and covering the gas and electricity wholesale markets, as well as retail markets and consumer issues in several reports. And we will try to streamline this, and potentially on the second session today, the chair of the customer retail market group, Anna Waschka-Nielsen, will maybe make some comments on that as well. So we are looking at our recommendations and work for sustainability indicators, see that we can monitor the progress in the energy transition, because it is not only important to implement the measures, but it is also important to monitor the progress relating to the objectives that we want to achieve. As I mentioned already, it is important that we incentivize consumers to change their behavior, to become active, while at the same time not leaving anyone behind. We know that consumers, that there are vulnerable consumers, but we of course also plan to, let's say, to widen the consumer that are active. One of the instruments that is now in place with the clean energy package here are the energy communities, and we look in how best to implement this in order to have a, let's say, consistent implementation as much as possible, because this then also contributes to a European internal energy market. So that is what we want to see here. And of course, as I said, this is linked to the general work that we are doing on increasing and contributing to having more flexibility in the markets in order to ensure the transition at least cost. Again, that is important for us, that the decarbonization takes place at least cost. So we see that the consumers in that sense are at the heart of the clean energy package, and therefore at the heart, let's say, of all these efforts, and will play an important part in this whole system approach as well. So these are, let's say, it's a broad overview, and I'm very glad so many of you are here, as we will have two, after the keynote from Clara. Sorry, Clara. Two interesting sessions and to discuss all these topics. We unfortunately have no one here from the presidency, from the Croatian presidency, but I think we will nonetheless have an important debate today. We also have several MEPs which come later, as there is still a session ongoing in the EP, but they will arrive. Last but not least, I would like to mention that Commissioner Simpson is unfortunately not able to come, but we have the Director General of DG ENER, Ms. Jorgensen, as a more than a replacement, I would say. The event is fully booked, and we are broadcasting it live. So I would be glad if you can post your own live tweets of today's discussion, and of course also participate in this discussion today. And with this, I would like to hand over to Sonja van Rossum, who is the moderator of the first session. Please, Sonja.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm a freelance energy and climate journalist based here in Brussels, for those of you I haven't met yet, where I write for publications such as Platts, Nature, Climate Change, Foresight, Climate and Energy, and Natural Gas World, just to mention a few. And I have the pleasure of moderating this next session for you. So this will take us through from, well, it's 9:30 now to 11 o'clock, when you'll be able to step out for coffee. And the focus of this session is to look at the whole system approach to the energy transition, so to decarbonization. As Annegret just emphasized, the purpose of this is to ensure a transition at low cost. And I think, certainly from my perspective, the new Commission's focus is very much on a system change, more so than we've had in the past when we've talked about renewables, we've talked about efficiency, we've talked about individual technologies. Now it's all very much about we need to transform the entire system. And as part of that, we also have indeed very relevant to consumers, a whole just transition dimension which didn't exist a few years ago and has become a very, I would say, important and strong part of the decarbonization discussion. So I'm gonna invite the panel up in a moment. We're gonna kick off with a presentation from Clara, as Annegret already said. Then we'll have a panel. We'll have an hour for that. So I'm gonna ask my panelists to please be brief. Please stick to just a couple of minutes for your answers, so we have time for a real exchange between you, and we'll have time for your questions as well. With that in mind, when you ask questions, I'm going to tell you right away now, the microphones are in the sides of your seats. Maybe have a look, or Una here is lifting one out. So to save us looking around for them, hunting around for them later, yeah, you got to basically tug on them, push the button, and then they should automatically switch on. In the armrest, yeah. So either on your left or on your right. Left side, okay. On your left, open it, pull it out, push the button, and that's it. And we'll end the session with an MEP, Mr. Krasnodebski, who's the vice chair of the ITRE committee, so the Industry Energy Research Committee in the Parliament, on the latest plans for, news on the Green Deal. The Parliament just voted through a resolution on that, and I think the latest on what kind of changes we can expect also to a 2030 target, and therefore the pace of the whole decarbonization process from now to 2050. One last point to mention, which is, I don't know how many of you have already seen or voted, but CEER opened a series of polls on Twitter, so you can see them on Twitter, obviously, at the CEER Energy handle. And there's 3 questions, and I would encourage you to answer them if you haven't yet. And we'll come to the results at the end of the panel then as a nice lead-in to our MEP, because one of the questions is, what should be the EU's minimum target for 2030? So that will give him something nice to respond to. So do go onto Twitter and answer those if you haven't already. I think that's it. No other housekeeping. Put your phones on silent, maybe. That's one thing I don't always remember. And with that, I'd like to invite up Clara Poletti and also all our panelists right away. So that's Mr. Stefan Kampusch, Mr. Zbigniew Boldysz, Mr. Christian Zinglersen, and Christian Ruby. If you'd all like to move up and take a seat on the panel already, then that will put us in a good position to kick off the debate immediately after Clara. Clara Poletti probably doesn't need much of an introduction. She's chair of ACER's Board of Regulators, more than 20 years experience in the energy sector, and is also with the Italian energy regulator, ARERA. Go ahead.
Okay. Okay. Good morning, everybody. It's a pleasure to be here. Annegret already introduced the topic, and thank you, Annegret. The energy sector is undergoing very profound changes, and with the clean energy, with the Green Deal, the level of ambition is increasing a lot. Somebody says that we will try to go to the moon. So we have to be ambitious enough, but at the same time, we have to live on Earth, where we are today, and find a way to go to the moon. So that's an interesting balance for us as regulators, trying to implement and be efficient in implementing the current rules, but at the same time, learn from what we have and what we see in the market, and help changing the rules and adapting them to be able to fulfill our ambitions. So the purpose of energy regulation in this transition is still ensuring a level playing field in which competition can flourish. I mean, this is important to remember, because even if we have to help and to find a way to support the transition, we still want to keep well-functioning and efficient markets. And so we have to work and make what we have today work efficiently, and we have to, at the same time, to look into giving the right price signals to adjust our energy portfolios for the future. And this is particularly relevant for the investment framework. On investment, we have to consider whether the current regulatory framework is fit for purpose when we look to the climate and energy policy objectives. Finally, when looking to the regulatory framework, we don't have to forget that our final and ultimate goal is to ensure sustainable and affordable energy for EU consumers. So the security of supply item is something that we often forget, because till we have security. When we lose it, then we realize how important that is. So it's important that security of supply stays in the radar, and affordability, of course, I don't even need to explain why that's relevant. So what we did in the joint CEER-ACER conclusion paper was to address those core themes, identifying 4 pillars. The first one is access and market monitoring. And this is what I was saying before. We have to make sure that we make our markets work, even the ones that we have today. And we have to make sure that that a technology-neutral approach is maintained there in order to ensure a level playing field for all innovative technologies as well. The second pillar is transmission tariffs and cross-border capacity allocation, because that's an important part of how our markets work. So an efficient tariff system is a condition in order to have an efficient market functioning and integrated market. The third pillar is governance, the governance of infrastructure development and the oversight of existing and new entities. Again, one challenge is to make sure that the new infrastructures will be developed in a framework that is coherent with the climate and energy policies. And so this is a very important part of our reflection on the future. And finally, dynamic regulation for new activities and technologies, because here we have a really big challenge as regulators. We need to give transparency and ex-ante certainty to the market, because that helps reducing the risk, that helps investment. At the same time, we need to be flexible and to be able to adapt the rules in order to avoid being locked in the wrong outcomes. So dynamic regulation is, again, a very big part of our reflection. This is just the beginning, a first step in our evaluation and reflection on the future. And as Annegret was saying, we still will have to work on it and improve it and see how to implement it. On access and market monitoring, here, where are we now? We see that EU consumers have actually seen tangible benefits from market integration. So this is something that is relevant to consumers as well. It's relevant for the industry, but it's relevant for consumers as well. Well-functioning markets are something that we should ensure. The challenges that we are facing here are first of all, a non-uniform situation in all Europe. We have in some regions, we see still weak competition. We see some bottlenecks in the infrastructures, insufficient liquidity on some balancing platforms, and possible market barriers from administrative and legal requirements, such as, for example, the licensing. So there is a need for improvement. So things are working well, but we could do better. What can we do? What are ACER and CEER responses? What we propose is to upgrade the current market monitoring system, using it as a basis for action. So improving the way the indicators are defined, including even indicators on sustainability, then identifying some indicators that can be used as a basis for action. And of course, if the market monitoring indicates that there is a problem, then that should prompt some reaction from the relevant authorities. That for NRAs would mean to look into the regulation and assess if there are improvements that can be implemented. So in this sense, a targeted regulation, and that's where flexibility comes in as well, targeted regulation can be used, where a regulatory toolkit could be defined to allow for specific measure to be implemented to address those issues. ACER would, of course, support for cross-border issues. The second theme is transmission tariff and cross-border capacity allocation. As I said before, this is linked to the way the market works. We have seen an increase in price convergence and a correlation. The yellow part in the graph is where the price differential has been going down below €1 per megawatt hour over time. So you see the yellow, the number of yellow countries has been increasing. So far, so good. Price convergence and correlation is there, but there are still areas in Europe where we have high price differentials, and some of them are some of the reasons why we still have price differentials are the transportation tariffs, together with low interconnection capacity levels and weaker competitive pressure. So these are some challenges that we need to address. When addressing the tariff framework, we have to keep in mind that we are moving towards a more integrated system where electricity and gas will be more integrated. So we have to make sure that we have to know and understand that differences between gas and electricity tariff frameworks could distort investment and operation of infrastructures in the view of sector coupling. Market competition is an objective, so another potential issue is the risk of market foreclosure in illiquid or concentrated markets. So that's another challenge that we have to keep in mind if we want to have well-functioning market. So what is the ACER response there? First of all, we are keen in implementing the rules that we have. So we are implementing the tariff network code at EU level. We see the need to fully implement the code, but at the same time, we see problems in some specific areas where tariffs could become a barrier to trade and where there is a risk of foreclosure of cross-border capacity. So here again, the idea is to keep some flexibility and unlocking regulatory tools that could address regional concerns. So if we have a concern in an area, we should address it, and we should make sure that barriers are reduced. And one way, for example, to reduce barriers would be to modify the reserve price when allocating capacity, or to merge market area. There are many ways forwards, but there should be flexibility to identify which one is better suited for the situation. It's clear that there probably some of those measures would need the implementation of an inter-TSO compensation mechanism, not a EU-wide, but maybe in the region where the problem has to be addressed. So we should establish a framework with common criteria for calculation of TSO's allowed revenues for the development of this ITC mechanism, because you understand, if I merge a market area, I need to have a common methodology to exchange and compensate TSOs. Again, I have to ensure that network charges provide a level playing field for electricity and gas, but this is something we already said many times. And maybe we will need additional measures to address market foreclosure. On governance of infrastructure and oversight of existing new entities, the use of gas infrastructure is going to change, and is already changing according to policies and actions that have been developed, but as well as according to the technological innovation. So here it's important to look into the way scenarios are defined, because uncertainty is higher, and to reflect on how system needs are defined. So the challenges here to be addressed is, first of all, on responsibility. Who should be ultimately responsible for planning network infrastructure? That's the first question. Then how do we go along if there are different views on infrastructure needs? And when we look into infrastructure needs, we know that the edges between competitive and monopoly activities is blurring somehow, because some non-monopolistic activities could address the energy needs of the system, competing with some monopolistic infrastructure. So we have a big change there, and we have to ask ourselves who can do what. Keeping, of course, the neutrality of TSOs, ensuring that an efficient and non-discriminatory third-party access is still applied. And as for hydrogen networks, here the challenge is really forward-looking, understanding how much the regulation should already take into account this development on hydrogen, or whether it would be better to wait and see if even the hydrogen network would merge in a mesh network or what. The responses are, of course, better explained in the document, and I had to summarize some points here, but please, I invite you to read the conclusion paper. First of all, I think we think we need to ensure consistencies between the national energy and climate plans and the scenarios. And of course, there is a need for consistency among the different plans, but at that point, between the plan and the scenarios we use. So maybe an improvement in the way and the regulatory oversight on the way the 10-1 NDP plan is defined could be effective. we need to improve the cost-benefit analysis methodology as well to make sure that externalities, environmental externalities are properly taken into account. Finally, dynamic regulation. On dynamic regulation, we have a wide range of different technologies to decarbonize gas. We have uncertainties about technology, uncertainty about demand. We need flexibility to cope with the future system needs. We need to make sure that we do not lock in wrong solutions. This is a clear challenge. If we go into the detail, first of all, we need to start understanding and clearly defining what does decarbonized gas mean? What is green gas? What is renewable gas? So understand what we are talking about. So we need definitions. We need to understand the impact of the different solutions on competitions and on regulated monopolies. That was I was saying before. And we need to make sure that we don't create distortions. So we allowed for a level playing field. So the ACER response there is, of course, to establish a definition of decarbonized gas, and to promote a market-based approach. So to stick to the market-based approach, I would say, and in developing new activities and technologies. So TSOs and DSOs should be precluded from investing in potentially competitive activities in general. But of course, we need flexibility there as well. Flexibility to allow the market to be kicked off and to make sure that those investments are realized in an efficient and timely manner. And on hydrogen, we still think there is a need to understand how much hydrogen will be part of the scene. So we are still open and interested in seeing what the developments are. So thank you for your attention. And again, I invite you to read the conclusion paper together with the ACER recommendation that has been approved in line with what jointly prepared for the conclusion paper. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Is that on? Are there any clarification questions to Clara immediately? She's going to join us on the panel, so if you have questions for her later, you're welcome to put them to her then. But is there any immediate question on what she's just presented? I don't see one. So I propose we kick off with our panel. So as I said, we have about an hour for this. And we have representatives from both the ENSOs, so all the network operators, gas and electricity side, from ACER, so the regulators, and finally Eurelectric, so representing the European electricity industry. The focus for the discussion is this whole system approach. So coupling of gas and electricity, but more than that, the entire energy system to ultimately get to the most sustainable, affordable, and of course, secure energy transition that we can here in Europe. So I'd like to kick off with ENSOG. So we have Stefan Campos here, who's president of ENSOG, has been since it was set up just over 10 years ago now. And apart from that, is chairman of the board of management at CEER Gas Transport, which is the owner of Open Grid Europe, formerly Aon Gas Transport. So I think to kick us off, we've heard about the importance of sector coupling. We know that power to gas technology is at the core of that. But what would you say at this stage? We've had a lot of talk. We've had a lot of discussion already probably about what we'd like the new Commission to do. If you had to drill it down, what is needed now to make sector coupling a reality rather than a nice to have?
Yeah. Thanks for inviting me, having me here, and telling the people that I'm old. But that was already very well known. Experience. Yeah, for me, it's. I remember when the last Commission kicked in, and the point was the energy union and the abolishment of the energy islands, the corridors of supply, the resilience. And in particular also the security of supply in Southeast, but also in the Northeast. And we all have done that. And we are very much concentrated on the security of supply focus. That was, I think, the last Commission. And in this triangle of security of supply, sustainability, and affordability, we also have worked a lot to interconnect the networks and save some costs. So now it's time to go back to the sustainability issue. And sustainability is something that is very well fitting to the Green Deal. And in our session here, sector coupling and the whole system approach, we can already see now that this will not be the one silver bullet that kills it all. So it's not that electricity does it, gas does it, heat does it. It is absolutely clear that we will have a very, very meshed network of sources. And to handle such a system on a daily basis without getting loss of the control over the cost and within a framework of keeping security of supply will be something for, let's say, decisive for the future. And the balance will always be endangered. The more we are looking for sustainability, the more we are losing security of supply if we don't get that right. So digitization, platforms, cooperation, coordination is the thing in the middle that needs to keep all these elements together. And this is why we always believe that the integration of the parts of the chain are the important thing, and that on a horizontal, but also on a vertical level. And on the horizontal level, it's the roles of the different systems for the transport of energy. It is the key task in the future with more and more renewables in the network for the gas system to provide flexibility and stability to the electricity networks. So that, I think, will become our key objective, that at any time when needed, gas is there to stabilize the electricity networks. In particular, when it comes to the question of the storage, might that be days, might that be weeks, might that be seasons? Then the next point is, when we do that, we will have to address different needs in different locations, and that is why we will endanger also the integrity of the market. We have done such a lot, and Clara has shown the yellow Europe in one price zone. So if we have then many sources and many different tools and many different interconnections, it will be very difficult to maintain the integrity of the internal market, but that is, in any case, something we have to achieve. There might be a need for decoupling more and more physical from virtual flows, trading from what happens in the networks. So to compete in a non-distorted manner in such a new framework is the other key element. So what we have today already is a fully working system. Whatever we do it now in addition, but with a view to the sustainability and the reduction of greenhouse gas emissions. But if we afford now a double layer, we have to do that at, I wouldn't say at least cost, but in any case, cost, sustainability and security of supply have to be always balanced, because someone will have to pay the bill afterwards, and the societal effects are already now visible. So we must not lose that also out of control. And what we have seen in studies from Ecofis, but also from Puri, is that there are huge investments that you can spare, that you can avoid, if you only combine the networks in the best way and run something that we call the hybrid system. So a fully integrated system that allows you to make full use of gases of whatever form and electricity at the same time. And this kind of hybrid system will, of course, then bring more resilience in this future, where we have to act with very different sources of energy that might be central, decentralized, that might be import-oriented, but that might be also a local production. And this is why we support the European Green Deal, because we find the elements there, but it will be the job of the TSOs to keep that in balance. And the first thing we have done is we have worked jointly on the scenarios, have joint scenarios. We have then worked on coordinating the TYNDPs. And of course, I can understand that Clara says we need to approve them. Our first point is we need to be aligned with the national plans, because we cannot do something in pure fantasy and forget that the national plans are also very decisive. Then we do that on our European level and get as close to the best as we can. And then it is the responsibility of the TSOs to implement that. An approval by ACER might be helpful, but ACER should be careful, because if you take over the responsibility, then you also will have to find out the mechanisms if something goes wrong. Up to now, this would be our part. Consultation, integration of whatever requests are there, but I think we should leave the responsibility for the development of networks and cooperation and planning and scenarios very much with those who have to implement them afterwards. This is why NSOC has set up a roadmap 2050, and in this roadmap we would support the establishment of a regulatory framework for this hybrid system. We would coordinate the planning of the electricity and the gas grids even the more. We would clarify the roles and responsibilities in this new market, and we have to avoid and find ways of a non-distortive competition, in particular when it comes to taxes, levies, so a level playing field in order to get the best out of this new system. Thank you.
Thank you very much. A lot of interesting points and plenty, I think, for the other panelists to comment on. I'd like to turn next to Mr. Zbigniew who's Vice President at NSOE and with the Czech TSO, where he's also a member of the board. And the question, picking up also on what Stefan just said, one of the points you made, we have these joint scenarios now between the two NSOs. We have some coordination, some joint planning. How could that further be improved, and to what extent are there genuinely different visions of the energy system going forward, which means, is it then left to regulators someone has to decide what's in the interest of the consumer, what is the best low-cost, most sustainable scenario going forward? Can you do that together, just you?
Okay, thank you for the floor. Before I start, I can tell you that when I started trading power back in 2003 in Munich, we spent a number of weekends and evenings talking about how can we trade spark spread. And that was the first thinking about what gas and electricity can do in financial terms. I never was thinking, and I think nobody in that pub was able to think so far that we'll be one day sitting here and coupling these sectors and seeing TSOs working together and building joint scenarios. So it's a big appreciation in the beginning for what I observed in my path working with the electricity. Regarding the answer, who should decide? I'm always on side of the customer, so I think the customer should decide and say whether the scenario or whether the solution is beneficial for him, yes or no. Of course, we are TSOs, we are heavily regulated, and this is our daily business to stick to the fit-to-purpose approach. So we definitely will never waste any resources and go ahead to foster the markets and be as efficient for the customers. Regarding our cooperation with NSOG, I think a lot of things were said by Stefan already. We are building the joint scenarios. We exercise discussions where we involve more than 80 participants from 35 countries. We are trying to be really as open as possible because the experience from the last decades was very clear. We need to tackle the systems as a whole. We can't just say now we will deal only with one element. It's not possible any longer because when we simulate any future scenario nowadays, this flexible and integrated energy market should be not restricted to one sector only. That's very clear. We've got storage, we got aggregation, we got demand-side response. So we see that the synergies to convert power to gas, other liquid fuels, to store it and to couple with all these sectors is essential to reach the climate targets which were mentioned in the beginning and which are the basic reason why we are here now. So to deliver the power to gas is very important to deliver high operational flexibility to the electricity system, and we are in ENTSO-E very much aware of the fact that the future is electric, that we are moving in that direction, and it's something that is inevitable. And we are aware that we can't adopt anything else but a holistic approach to this. So in practical terms, we will always be here for the entire, in this entire setup, the ones who will look after the security of supply while serving as a reference point and allowing everybody else to plug in this platform and build their own solutions on above this solid basis. In very practical terms, what we will do in the coming year, we want to define principles. We want to better estimate decarbonization of the transport, which we see as a very important thing to be clarified. We will build new relationships with all relevant associations in order to clarify questions and all unclear elements which were mentioned by the previous speakers. We would like also to analyze costs and efficiency of energy conversion, definitely to avoid double conversion of electricity into green hydrogen and back because of the efficiency. And we want definitely strongly coordinate with DSOs, where I always highlight the importance of presence of TSOs on the local level, because with the distributed generation is getting more and more important to act locally while thinking European and regionally coordinate. The next point, I fully agree with Stefan, clear definition what is green. It's very important because we always need to ensure that the balance in feed of power is there when conversion takes place, and also the electrolyzers must be properly positioned in the grid geographically, and this must make sense. This is the way, from financial point of view, so this is the way how we can ensure efficiency. And also, we need to clarify what green gases are indeed. So what is about blending, how to consider gas from carbon capture storage, and so on. And last but not least, we are always on side of technology neutrality, also having the ENTSO-E members who are much more into dealing with power to heat than power to gas because of their natural setup in the countries and the energy mix. So we would like to ensure that level playing field will be across technologies. Hence, it's important to consider coupling across sectors. So I think that's enough. And I didn't met your couple of minutes requirements, so sorry for that.
No, it's okay, perfect. Thank you for that. Again, I think plenty to follow up on. I hope you're staving up some questions. Let's move on to the regulators then. We already heard from Clara. I'd like to welcome Christian Zinglersen, who's took over the directorship at CEER from Alberto Potocnik at the start of this year, and came to the job from heading up the Clean Energy Ministerial Secretariat at the IEA in Paris. I guess two questions. One is, as it says in the program, how ready are we for all of these changes in terms of infrastructure, markets regulation, and also, of course, the follow-up, how do you see the role of regulators and CEER going forward? To what extent is it your responsibility to ensure I guess, an optimal vision and investments for the future energy system?
Thanks a lot. Thanks for the welcome. It's my 14th day on the job, and it's interesting that my first event on day 14, or my first event as CEER director here on day 14, is in Residence Palace. One of the very first files I worked on as a very junior member of the Danish Foreign Service was whether the council should buy Résidence Palace, and if so, at which cost, and what would be the regulatory oversight, so to speak, of that? So it was a fairly basic question, not very dissimilar to the tough choices and discussions we have ahead for the changing energy system of Europe. But it's a nice coincidence to be here at my first event as Alberto's successor. Like Clara and also Annegret were mentioning, sort of what inspires me a bit as a new director on the job in terms of addressing you, my fellow panelists, and you as an audience, in terms of future challenges, is this bridge beyond 2025 communication, not because it's set in stone or anything, but because I think it brings out a number of relevant insights. And in terms of your question, the second question, role of regulators and regulation, etc., I think I would just pin it very briefly as we have very fascinating and changing times ahead, but we also have some very sound principles of regulatory oversight. However, how we apply those principles, I would suspect, would look quite different in the future. So that would be my shorthand bumper sticker type answer to that. Then in terms of how I would see how ready infrastructure and markets and the like are for sector coupling, I'd say a little bit about infrastructure and then markets, and then maybe give you my sort of my bigger picture type view, which some of you may find slightly too conceptual, but then ask a follow-up question in the ensuing round if you want. On infrastructure, as my previous speakers have pointed out too, there are likely some significant changes ahead, part driven by technology development, partly driven by some size of the challenges set by political leaders in times of the decarbonization challenge and the rapidity of which it needs to be addressed. So it would seem that we most definitely need this, shall we say, more coherent approach on energy infrastructure planning. And I think it's very good that NSOC and NSOE have teamed up to work much more closer together in terms of that infrastructure planning effort, which you also were speaking of. At the same time, because of the changes in energy markets driven by, say, decentralization or digitalization, that will probably allow for, shall we say, bypass of some networks in addressing identified needs in the future. And I think that brings up probably some new approaches in the future to system management, and maybe also new approaches in terms of identification of overall system needs. I know NSOE has put forward the system of systems type approach, which I find sort of intuitively appealing. I also mentioned it to Laurent when we met before I took up my functions. It seems like a right concept to think of it as system of systems. That multiplicity also, I think, brings up the need to bring in a multiplicity of views in the identification of system needs going forward. And we will be discussing, I guess, much more further ahead how we see that identification of overall system needs, how that becomes a multiplicity of efforts commensurate with the system of system types of views. Secondly, on markets, a bit like I think you were also going through, Clara, there are likely some important tweaks going forward on markets. Basically, when two energy forms become more substitutable and hence can compete more, it would make sense to look at cross-border charges and possible differences between tariff frameworks as a function of that. This is the proverbial level playing field, I guess, which would merit some attention going forward. Another, I think, fundamentally sound market principle, which we definitely should retain, but maybe the application of it will look a bit different in the future, is in terms, as you were saying, Clara, on who does what, who can do what, so to speak. And I guess when we talk about power to various things, electrolysis, using electricity to do something, it would strike me that it is sort of inherently, at least potentially, a competitive type activity. Maybe it needs to get off the ground here and there, and that can warrant some special attention, but otherwise it will strike me as being an inherently competitive activity, and the regulation should reflect that. Finally, broader picture, abusing the 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 minutes I'm taking here. Sometimes I discuss with others When we look at the size of the challenges ahead, there's a conceptual question which pops up, I think, for many of us, which is, broadly speaking, what is the role of markets, as opposed to what is the role of markets supplemented by something else, which could be planning, market actor coordination, state intervention, which is always for a regulator, I guess, something one needs to look at a little bit carefully. But it is a conceptual question, and no one really has a crystal ball on that one. The only thing I would offer, perhaps, is it's likely, as we have seen developments in the energy systems up until now, it'll probably be a mix of market coordination, planning type efforts also in the future. And because of the changes we're facing, I think this concept of dynamic regulation and having an openness, readiness to continuously assess and monitor where we're going so one can adjust a bit, I think will be key. Again, one can be driven towards more market or more planning per ideological preferences, but if we look at it a little bit from a distance, this continuous assessment and monitoring, I think, will be key. Those were my 2 cents on day 14. Happy to engage in the Q&A. Maybe you, Christian, well, after the introduction.
Thank you very much. And yes, last but certainly not least, Christian Ruby, Secretary General of Eurelectric, previously with Wind Europe, previously in Connie Hedegaard's cabinet. You may remember him from there. So representing the electricity sector, and I guess I guess you're going to tell us how you see the role of electrification. The questions that would come to my mind are, do we need a hybrid system? And hybrid in what sense? How much gas? What do you need from other parts of the system that aren't electricity? And also there's this question of what is green. We've talked about we need to define what is green in a gas sense, but you can of course argue any pipe, any wire is only as green as what you put through it. So how do you fit that with the push we have for electrification very specifically as an essential means of decarbonizing the economy?
Thank you, Sonia. Thank you, Christian. So this whole system approach, well, I think what's really characteristic of the Green Deal is that we decisively have to move to that whole system approach in the sense that the decarbonization efforts cannot stop at a few sectors or one sector only. We really need to see how we decarbonize the whole system in order to deliver on these very, very bold and ambitious objectives. So what is characterizing the changes in the system that we're seeing now? I would point to 3 things. First of all, a significant decentralization compared to earlier on. Secondly, a digitization, as mentioned by Stefan already. And third, of course, electrification. No matter how we turn and toss it, this transition will more and more come back to electricity. Will it only come back to electricity? No, I think we're past that debate about the all electric. There's only one sector really talking about that, and it's not the electricity sector. But according to pretty much any piece of analysis out there, doubling down on decarbonization means doubling up on electricity, doubling the output at least of electricity by mid-century. And with all this talk about integration and everything that needs to happen, we just need to bear in mind that in parallel with this, we need a massive transformation of the power sector, a massive build-out of the power sector, unprecedented. And we really mustn't underestimate this challenge. We mustn't get intimidated either, but we have to be very, very serious about the scope and the size of this challenge. Now, that, of course, points also to the infrastructure, how to transport all that power. And we know that part of this power will be eventually transported by gas infrastructures as well. We're very clear about that. The question is, what's the balance? And I think this is the major question that is unsolved today, and where I will not hesitate to say that we disagree quite fundamentally, and have serious concerns about the current draft scenarios presented by NSOE. We do not think that these scenarios present an infrastructure vision that is able to support the build-out of the power sector as it is foreseen. These scenarios are not aligned with the Clean Planet for All document, the scenarios presented by the Commission. We saw the draft earlier presented in Clara's presentation. This needs improvement. Sorry to be so blunt, but I think it's important also to say this very clearly at this stage, because if we start the CBA process now, and if we adjust the methodology and we have the perfect methodology for the CBAs, but we run these CBAs on a wrong set of assumptions, we're going to end up in the wrong place. And just to be very clear, we have to align the infrastructure build out with the national plans, but we should not think that we're going to burn as much natural gas in 20 years as we do today. That would result in a wrong type of infrastructure reinforcements paid by taxpayers' money and presenting a significant political risk. So working together is important. Let's make sure that that continues, but let's also improve and make sure that a proper oversight structure is created, a proper governance structure that ensures that not only the owners of this infrastructure are firmly involved in this exercise, but that there's also a clear third-party scrutiny, oversight, and let's say robust feedback. We welcome the role of ACER in this. We also think that it would be good to involve an independent institution of some kind. It could be perhaps the Copenhagen Infrastructure School to provide a set of really completely independent scenarios here. And further to the governance, I think we also have to look at this issue, and I'll wrap up with that. How do we ensure the right signals to build out this infrastructure? One thing is about the tariffs, which is a must. We have to change the tariffs to reflect the new realities. And we have to also look at other sources of funding for the infrastructure build-out. We have to reflect in the infrastructure build-out this major shift to decentralization, that the distribution grids will play an increasingly important role in the future energy system. The players of the distribution grids need to be firmly involved in this exercise of defining the needs and be part of that multiplicity of stakeholders mentioned by Christian. We need to see them as a privileged partner inside this exercise, but we also need to see, let's say, the need for increased funding reflected in the regulation. The 10E needs to be revised with a view to ensuring additional money flowing to distribution grid reinforcements. This will be a critical element of ensuring success for electrification of transport and many of the other things that this transition ultimately will rely on. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much. I'll give the others a chance to come back in a moment, but one question to you, Christian, is the whole system approach to decarbonization is, as you say, very much based on more electrification, a build-out of the power sector. That assumes that all that power is going to be clean, abundant, affordable, all the rest of it. So can Europe's power sector deliver?
Absolutely. The company has been very clear. We've set out a goal for ourselves to become carbon neutral by 2045 at the latest, and I think it's really about making things happen in the short term. Then we have to look at the last 5% of emissions at some point, which will be difficult. But we have a bit of time to address that still. The challenge in the next 10 years is really to start a massive upscaling of some of the technologies. Offshore wind, just to mention one. Our scenarios, as well as the Commission scenarios, foresee some 400 gigawatts of offshore wind being part of this. 400 gigawatts, that's compared to 25 today. So we're looking at an unprecedented industrial upscaling of a technology, which will take time and will require planning. The same goes for some of the other renewable technologies. We will need significant additional deployment of solar, of onshore wind, and we'll also need a backup fleet of conventional plants, especially in the transition period, but also to handle flexibility in the longer term.
Okay, thank you. Clara, if you wanted to just...
Thank you. Just to like to go back to this infrastructure planning, because the ACER proposal was mentioned by Stephen. Here, without entering into the details, I think we should agree on the objective. The objective is to ensure consistency between words and actions, because otherwise we risk increasing the risk. Sorry for the wording. And that's something that for the market can be very costly, and finally for final consumers. So the market must trust that what we are saying we will do, we actually do it. Maybe we know that scenarios are always wrong, but at least the effort to move in that direction should be clear, and should be clear for everybody. Otherwise, the risk, even if each of us is working on within his best professional abilities, at the end, summing up all the efforts, you end up with an inefficient result. Then we can discuss on how to get there. That's a detail. But the objectives should be, I think, understood and clear for everybody, and I hope we are on the same side there. And working on coordinated planning is a big part of this whole system approach, and thank you for what you are doing. In our view, is not enough. We can do better, and so let's define what that means.
Thank you. I'd like to ask each of the ENSO representatives to come back and maybe give a response to Christian. Your scenarios don't adequately reflect the potential transformation of the energy system. They're not aligned with the Paris Agreement. How do you respond to that?
Well, I think I quite clearly said that the major objective of ENSO is to include all the stakeholders and have the debate open. We are now in the beginning of a very long journey, and what we want to do is to make the things right and ensure that we do the right things. So from this perspective, we are definitely open to discussion, and we welcome all interventions of other stakeholders. And definitely this doesn't mean that our scenarios are carved in stone and we will now stick to them completely. What we want is an open debate, and we fully agree that this consultation process should continue, and we should set up a structure and a governance for this as well. So I think there is no controversy on this topic. We clearly understand it, but there was something to begin with, and these were our scenarios. And definitely there is always some space for improvement. Nobody's perfect. So we'll definitely carry on and go ahead with improvements in order to ensure that everybody is not only happy, but everything does make sense, and that this whole system view is really considered.
Do you think they would benefit from greater oversight by ACER and/or another independent institution?
Well, I think we keep benefiting from the oversight of ACER as we speak. So definitely a cooperation with our regulators, both on the European and national level, is essential to this, because these are the ones who always obey the efficiency and ensure that this does make sense for the customer. We have another angle where we would never compromise, which is the security of supply, unless we are asked to change that.
Okay, Stefan, are you overestimating future gas demand? I know the gas industry has done so on occasions in the past. What's your current position on that?
Yeah, but if you look at the last maybe 3-5 years, I would say we were pretty on track with our forecasts as regards demand. And I fully agree, first of all, with Christian when he says there will be not that much of natural gas in these pipelines in the future. That is clear. But I would expect other gases. The other point where I fully agree with Zdeněk Boldis and with ENSOE's thoughts is we need to integrate several thoughts. And please don't forget that first, if you tell us be aligned with the European targets, then there is a difference coming from national targets. But if a certain country and a certain region have their plan, they will fulfill this plan, implement it and end somewhere, then I cannot fully disregard that. Then it is perhaps an interesting task on a Brussels and Parliament and Council level to say we need more agreement and alignment on the plans, and then we develop that in accordance. The second is all these 400 gigawatt are not available and not over all the time. I'll give you an example. If you have today 90% hard coal in the electricity generation mix of Poland, they first need to do the first steps. I mean, they can wait that something happens, but the best thing is to do the first things first, and they will heavily invest in the interconnection of their networks with Norway, with their neighboring states, and develop more LNG and most probably more nuclear. So they have their plan and they need to do the first things first and do not wait 20 years and hope that something has happened. So first of all, alignment between the nations and the European view, alignment between the higher level and the lower level, which is not only the transmission level and the distribution level, is all the things that go on the level of the cities and the regions that needs to be integrated. And this is why I so much agree that we have to listen to what they are planning and then get the system of systems. And I think it's a very good expression, because we will handle a more and more fragmented and complicated system. And I think I've discussed with Alberto Potocnik 1,000 times, and the first thing he always says is the efficiently incurred costs. If I look back, we should have spent a little bit more cost on digitization to handle these different qualities, to handle these masses of devices coming into that also on a distributed level, and I think we are lagging very much behind. But the first thing is align with the different levels, align the expectations, and then I think I can fully agree with Clara, then we have this what you say, planning needs a consistency and needs an aligned approach, and we get there, obviously, you know? But also we have to talk about the differences that are there. And if you listen to Christian and me, yes, I think 75% we will agree, but there are still 25 outstanding. And it is about alignment here also.
Yeah, Christian.
The other Christian. See, he's with a K. Maybe just add to what you just said about this alignment of different levels. There's EU level, there's member state level, there's higher, lower level, etc. And I think I would agree with that. And I also think there is an alignment to be made, and is perhaps being made, but will probably increasingly need to be made, between some of the very impressive targets, you were also mentioning them, Christian, targets or modeled likelihood achievement, say in offshore wind and other very, very significant increases in generation infrastructure. Alignment with that and some of these infrastructure challenges or transmission challenges. And I sense sometimes a very strong political appetite and interest, quite rightly, to focus on the build-out of generation capacity, and there's perhaps slightly less attention sometimes to how that will actually be made to function then in terms of what is the realistic infrastructure build-out commensurate with that. And I think that also applies to offshore wind in key regions of Europe. Unless, of course, you were to say that the majority of the offtake of those vast generation facilities would be close to shore or just on shore. That would have very significant implications for where you place energy and electricity intensive industry in the future, and that may be the future. But I don't necessarily see as much political debate about those implications of, shall we say, not having a commensurate infrastructure focus. So I think it's quite right that we are focusing a lot on infrastructure here in the bridge paper, but also in the discussion here today. I think that is quite right. And again, it'll be complex, it'll be multiple stakeholder, and we need to find a way of identifying system needs which the major stakeholders are broadly comfortable with in this sort of handshake we're entering into in the future, I guess. Maybe that's slightly beyond the strict ACER hat, it's just a broader perspective.
One question to you, and then we'll see if there are any questions from the floor. So Christian with a C, which is to what extent are regulators prepared to let network operators spend more. I mean, the remit has traditionally been to deliver a secure supply of energy at least cost. Yeah. Now we have the sustainability dimension, so our regulator is ready to change the rules, to let them innovate and potentially spend more to deliver the whole system transition.
That's a really good question. You know, the easy way out of that question would be, why don't you ask the regulators who've been in the job for more than 13 days what they think? But I don't think you've
had a good briefing.
Yeah, you wouldn't find that a satisfactory answer, I guess. So I'll be a little bit nervous, not nervous, but soft on this one. I'd say my impression, again, these are early days, right? And they're fairly intuitive, is that I think most people understand that what got us here will not necessarily be enough to get us there, so to speak, in terms of what the priorities are set politically. I would be surprised if there were many regulators who would not see that, you know, political trajectory as impacting concrete decisions. I don't know my colleagues that well enough to see if they see it exactly identically from member state to member state. But maybe, Clara, you will also have a view. I would think that, of course, we operate as regulators in a context which is ultimately set by decision makers who are democratically elected, and that has implications for how we would apply fundamentally sound principles going forward. So it's a rounded answer to your question.
Clara?
Just to add, it's a very big question, very good one. At national level, regulators are already working because things are happening. Just to mention something, we are working on resilience of the networks because we are already experiencing problems and an increased number of what we used to call rare events, and now I'm not getting rare anymore. We are working on sandboxes, regulatory sandboxes that now we propose to develop at EU level as well, are a reality in many countries already. We are working on final customers to make them more aware of how the market works and to improve the information that they have. They are going to be at the center of the new market, so that's a very key part of our job. So we are working there now. It's time to say, is there anything we need to harmonize at EU level in order to sort of leverage on what single NRAs are already doing and help other regulators to take advantage from what has already been done, because you don't need to invent the wheel every time. So I think we are there, but things are already happening.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you for that. Are there questions from anyone? Yeah, I see a couple. Let's start with the lady here and just introduce yourself briefly.
Yeah, Christine de Klerk. I'm representative of CEER, which is the Belgian TSO and DSO Federation. Thanks to have mentioned the important role of the DSO because they are not represented on the floor, and that's a reality. They will have a big challenge in the futures because of all the decentralized scenarios. But anyway, TSO and DSO will have lots of investment to do. Very big ones, well, new ones, and some retrofit of the existing infrastructure. And we are facing a paradoxical period right now. The Commission have communicated on the EU investing plan, which is not give not lots of place in the financing from this investing plan, and on the other side, the taxonomy will not give lots of place for the DSO and TSO if the delegated act do what the tech report has thought about. So the question is, how can we have the best way to finance the big investment at the good rate to have affordable tariff? That's my question.
Okay, is your question to anyone in particular?
it could be how are you going to defend the position of the DSO and TSO in the financing of the investment?
Okay. Let's take the other two questions I saw right away as well. Yep, the lady there, and then Laurent. Yeah, go ahead.
Hi, Nora Tabor-Kalinski from EDF Trading. So the EU is undoubtedly taking the lead internationally in terms of changing regulation for decarbonization, both in power and in gas. My question would be, this brings with itself a number of risks, including the risk of competition for European businesses from entities that are not based in Europe and operate under a different regulatory regime. Is this a factor that you are considering in regulatory planning or in planning out scenarios for the future development of sector coupling? So in addition to things that were mentioned, such as cost for consumers or cost for industry within Europe. And do you see international competitiveness of European businesses as a limiting factor in the decarbonization agenda? And if so, how do we deal with that? Thank you.
Thank you. And Laurent?
Yes, maybe I would like to speak not with a question, but few comments in fairness. I'm Laurent Schmidt, the Secretary General of NSOE, and I would like to speak very briefly on behalf of the over 300 FTE. We worked during the summer on producing the NSOE and NSOG report. And responding a bit to Christian's commentary, and I would really like to highlight the work which has been done on few fronts. First, it's based on National Energy and Climate Plan, bottom-up, taking into account working constructively in refining the content of these National Energy and Climate Plans. Second element, I think it's very much projecting already the amount of hydrogen, clean gas, and so on. And today, when I talk internationally about the quality of the work to Japan, to China, and so on, I'm not aware of such a document having been produced so far. And so before, I would say, throwing too much criticism into the document and so on, I would like to illustrate this is a very interesting starting point to trigger the debate and have a constructive debate, and we are still in a debate phase. That was just a clarification.
Okay, thank you. Let's see, we're probably only going to have time for one round of answers. I see one other question, and we'll take these two. How long are your questions? Small. Okay, we'll take these three questions, then we'll come to the panel for a final round. I see our MEP has arrived, so I don't want to keep him waiting too long. Yes, start with the gentleman, and then go to the lady and the final gentleman.
That's work. Yeah, great. Hello, I'm Martin Schick. Can you hear me? Is that right? Yeah. From the Czech Energy Regulator Office and also on the CEER board. It's maybe a follow-up on one of the previous questions. Clearly, our ambitious decarbonization policies have implications in terms of our competitiveness, but do you see any opportunities for actually exporting our solutions as other regions in the world are looking to integrate and also decarbonize? And I think Europe, our integration projects, be it on the gas side and perhaps even more so on the electricity side, I would say are at the forefront of digitized options, and yeah, let's export services rather than goods.
Yeah.
Carmen Bindel, representing Naturgy and Integrated Power and Gas Electricity. First question, Christian, have you updated the electric scenarios where you said that electrification will reach will be double than today? So no, it's the same. We're talking about the same as we have now, 24, 25%. Okay, it's the same. You are talking about the same scenarios. Okay. Okay. Thank you very much. Second question, regarding green gases, what green gases are. I think we should also to try to understand what happened with green electrification. The European Commission has identified that there are some kind of false green claims. Is identified in the new Green Deal. So let's have a look and try to learn lessons. And third, is not a question, is that, I mean, if we want to have a whole system approach, I miss some part of the industry within the panel. I miss somebody from the gas system. I think the next months they will have to play an important role So it will not be a whole system approach without the industry. Thank you very much for the time.
Okay, thank you. And Reiner. Yeah, the microphone is in your left-hand seat. Panel, other side. Yeah, and just pull it out, push the button, and that should be it.
Is it on?
Yes.
Yeah. My name is Rainer Lüttgus. I'm EU correspondent for Energy Germany. Question to ACER. What do you think about the current PCI list, the projects of common interests? And can you tell me clearly what you think about your joint scenario of NSOE and NSOX scenarios, joint scenario? And do you want to have more power concerning the TYNDPs in the future? Do you want, perhaps you can make the plans also, no? Couldn't you?
Okay, thank you. To some extent, we've probably gone into that last question already. Thank you also for the comments. I've noted, at least 3 concrete questions. One is the question on TSO, DSO financing in future, but what's the best way of doing that? And secondly, several questions around industry. Okay, the gas industry not present on the panel here, point taken, but more is international competitiveness being taken into account in your thinking, and are there export opportunities? And the third question to ACER, your views on the current PCI list, the joint scenarios, and I guess it comes back to your view on the kind of infrastructure rollout we need and your role in that. So those are the 3 questions. I'd like to give perhaps each of you the floor. Maybe we'll start with Stefan and end with Christian. Try and be brief, please, and I'll leave it to you to decide which. You don't all have to answer every question, which question you want to pick up on. Go ahead.
The balancing of sustainability and affordability is a key point as regards to competitiveness, but I think that alone will not do it. We have to think in parallel to whatever we do and how clever we do it, how smart we do it. We have to think in parallel about cross-border CO2 taxes, something like that, or taxing the product as such in order to have a level playing field with all those who will not do that. And after a while, if we get the job done rightly, the others will follow. Second, if we do it rightly and if we develop technologies that allow us to integrate the system, I think there's a lot of room for engineering services, production that we can export, and it can also lead, if we get that right, to a green and sustainable energy in Europe that would allow us also to export these products with a special stamp on them. So not only that we can export services, not only that we can export technology, we can also export products. And this is high-level engineering, but we will be in stiff competition with China, in particular Korea and Japan, and then China. But we have to get it right. If we don't get it right, we will export nothing and fail. So this, what dynamic regulation, the other side of it is dynamic development of the system and the interaction of the systems. And to handle that and to not lose out at any time on security of supply. Because if that is wrong, then everything is wrong. So this is why it's touchy and it needs perhaps continuous redirection, but I don't see that negatively. I see that positively. But I cannot imagine that we can do it without thinking about the financial side in order to come to a level playing field.
Thank you. Could you pick up on the financing question? Maybe? Yeah.
Yeah, financing, it's the basis of our operation. So when there was a question on DSO, TSOs, they are both in the same situation under the regulatory framework. And what we expect is that there will be ACER in all these debates included and bringing their inputs and always be an integral part of where we can reach the efficiency of what we are doing. So there is no doubt about that. The question is what kind of incentives we can find out, because then you are seeing all these elements and it's a kind of diamond which is hard to fill on all directions, where it should be financially viable, it should be secure from the security of supply point of view. At the same time, we need to have it from technological point of view aligned. So there will be many aspects. And of course, this financial element is there. We would always welcome if there is let's say, common sense in all the proposals. That's number one. And what ACER could do and where they can help us is not only being softer. That's something where we always have some discussions which are natural. But what we would really appreciate is to have enough room for operating and for developing the solutions which are towards the whole system view. That's what we need to do. While we are fulfilling enormous amount of other requirements, we would really appreciate to have the life a little bit more simple in our complex world when it comes to items like, fulfilling some 70% on the borders and that kind of stuff. So we can really deliver elsewhere in better, and I think also the society at large would benefit from that.
Thank you. Acer, Christian.
Thanks. I don't think I'll pronounce myself on the competitiveness of Europe and border tax adjustment. I think that is more a political question on how to go about preserving decarbonization objectives in an increasing globalized world. I will maybe answer, as others, address Martin's question from the Czech regulator about the possibilities of exporting solutions. I know less about the engineering services export, perhaps even less about the commodities export, but I have a little bit of experience in sort of regulatory export, so to speak, in various configurations. I would say on the commodity side, it is a pretty live discussion in parts of the world, whether hydrogen or green gases can be an export commodity of the future, mimicking a little bit the oil industry. That will require a lot of innovation and a lot of cost decreases, obviously, but I don't think it's completely blue sky to think that 20, 30 years from now, you could have a globally traded commodity type system, which of course would draw on competitive advantage, as you see in other globalized products. And if you have impressive renewable resource endowments and you have lower shipping costs, why not? But that's a longer term view, I think. I don't think most people see the costs bringing us there right now. What I would say in terms of your question of the regulatory export, I have some experience working with the Chinese or the Indians or the Brazilians or South Africans and other folks around the world. And it strikes me how interested they are, not necessarily fully wanting to apply 100% of our experiences, but very interested in how we go about a much more integrated European power system. Laurent will know full well, he also has a good travel kit. Chinese are looking to have a much more efficient dispatch system as opposed to a more planning, so-called fair dispatch system. I know the system operator of India is very interested in working with NSOE. Japanese are fascinated by the regulatory collaborative model we have in Europe, ACER and the National Regulatory Authority, et cetera, et cetera. Now, while that may be difficult to monetize on the bottom line, I think it's significant if you want Europe to play a larger role in the world, which some are quite keen to do. So it's part of the export picture, albeit it's not engineering services or commodity export, but I think it deserves mention. Very briefly on the specific questions, PCI list. We have, in the most recent PCI list, found it difficult to fully assess the methodology applied for the PCI list. And so we've had some concerns about it. But it was not a concern in the sense of saying or advising no to one particular part or yes to another part. Mm-hmm. It was a more methodological concern. And on joint scenarios, my impression of that, I would say a bit per Laurent's comment, I think it's good to do them, it's good to get going, and it would be surprising if they could not improve over time. And I think the more broader question, instead of the joint scenarios, is how do we make sure that identification of system needs in the future are, shall we say, a shared endeavor. That needs to be key, I think, given where we are. I'll leave it at that.
Thank you. Final thoughts, hopefully brief, from you, Christian with a K.
Yeah, maybe just to pick up on the question of DSO investments, which I find is really key. As I said, I think we really need to guard this balance of costs against the decarbonization objectives, and one critical space to watch is the grids, because we need to double investments, as I said. On the other hand, we can't allow prices to double. So we have to look on the one hand at smart investments, and this is where the digital component comes in as well. In many places, it might be possible actually to serve system needs with digital solutions rather than more copper, and that might be cheaper. Let's make sure that we allow for that in a proper manner in the way we structure investments and tariffs and the rules around investments. Then I think we should look at how we get public coffers or the EU coffers also to contribute to this, and this is where the 10E regulation comes in. Let's make sure that we keep this in mind when defining the priorities and the projects under the European Sustainable Investment Plan, that we see some money flow to this space. There's a lot of venture capital, there's a lot of institutional money looking for rent, looking to be served, and if we do this right, we can also leverage investments from other types of players here with a view to financing this part of the transition. On a closing note, I just want to say I do actually think that probably we're close to 75% in agreement with Stefan. The remaining 25 are quite important, so I'll also take up Laurent's invitation for a continued constructive dialogue on this. We will contribute, and we look forward to this. One crucial element is let's look at the governance together, and let's make sure that the distribution grids are an integral partner in this exercise. Mm-hmm. We really need that in order to get the infrastructure of the future right. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, and a big round of applause for our panel. Thank you, and you may have noticed the results from the Twitter polls are now up behind us. So we had 3 questions. This is as a lead-in to Mr. Krasnodebski, who will be our next speaker to take us through to coffee. One of the questions was, what's the minimum greenhouse gas reduction target we need for 2030? Well, most people are saying 60%. Which is more than the Parliament voted through in its resolution. I think they said it needs to be at least 55%. And the Commission is currently talking about 50 to 55%. And of course, the actual target is just 40. So we have an ambitious room. Can we get the second question up? What is key for sector coupling? So coupling gas and electricity. Probably not surprisingly, most of you are saying all of the above. So we need more, well, we just discussed this in the panel, more joint planning. Some of you saying we need more storage, and a lot of you saying, yes, a hybrid energy system. Again, that certainly concurs with, I think, what most of our panelists just said. And the third question, should the Green Deal's distribution effects be measured? Again, that's the answer I would have expected, yes, in an impact assessment. Of course, yeah, the impact assessment, well, the 2030 target proposal probably pushed back from the summer to this autumn, in part because the Commission says it needs a very solid basis, a strong impact assessment to be able to justify and defend that proposal going forward. So this certainly, I guess, is backing for the Commission's decision to take some more time to get it right. So thank you also for your participation until now. Then I'd like to welcome Mr. Zdzisław Krasnodebski from the European Parliament. You're going to pronounce your name better than I have just done. He's the Vice Chair of the ITRE Committee. He's from the ECR group, a Polish MEP who's been in the Parliament for the last 6 years now, and is hopefully going to give us some more insight into the Parliament's views on 2030, 2050, and how we're going to move this agenda forward as Europe as a whole. You can take the floor.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you for invitation. It is obviously very important and very interesting conference and very interesting results. And what actually I would like to do is that there is a small report what is going on in Parliament and how is the change, what is the mood. I am not engineer, I am sociologist and philosopher, social philosopher, so I can be very good, you know, if you ask me the question concerning attitude of the people. We, just because you mentioned the PCIs, we just, as you probably know, we voted this yesterday in the ITRE committee. There was an attempt to reject as a motion of resolution to put forward and then reject on the end the list. Probably there would be a attempt on those in the plenary, but in this very important voting, only 17 members of ITRE committee voted for the resolution, which aimed to reject the list, and 54, as far as I remember, for the list. Also my group, but also main group. And now I just would like to show you what is now the situation as a political landscape, how the group. So we had, as you also already mentioned, also the discussion with many, also with Green Deal and a resolution of the Parliament. During this first debate on Green Deal in December, we saw, not very surprising, divide between political groups, representative of Greens and Liberals from Renew Europe, who wanted actually even more ambitious proposal, ambitious targets, especially reduction by 2030. As we see, I don't know who was participating in this small enquete. There was a general in the Twitter, or just the people here from everybody who wanted. Yeah, it is. No, the question is if it represents your opinion or opinion from outside. And this group, as liberals and Greens, they actually initiated this resolution of climate emergency. In the socialist group, there are sometimes also geographical or regional differences, but they are stressed. They seem to count very much on Mr. Commissioner Timmermans as somebody on that huge project, and they also advocate very radical steps to be taken, phasing out fossil fuels, rising targets, and so on. Interesting enough, EPP is very ambiguous. As you know now, they lost this very dominant position. It is still the biggest political group in European Parliament, but is also split, I think, in the decarbonization ambitious, and there is also strong voice to hear strong voices in the favor of European industry. And so on. There is questions of the carbon leakage and losing of competitive advantages. This was in the debate, also very important motive. There's the questions, that we, as a European Union, we are going to give an example for the world, but we do not know how the world will react to our very proper behavior and so on. In the name of my group, ECR, my colleague Professor Legutko warned against sidelining member state governments on this fundamental things like new climate targets and And he remembered how long and painful was the process in the last legislative term, you know, that we then, after all, we decided this 40% of 2013. And so when I go back to the last term, we work very hard, I must say, on winter package before European election. This was also fast-tracked. It was really very difficult for the Parliament, I think for the whole European institution, actually, to get us through. And now we are confronted with the new ambition. I just came from the hearing, from the exchange of opinion with Madam Simpson, our commissioner, and I will say some words about this. What is my impression after this exchange of impression? If we look at the resolution, which was adopted on 15 January, then we see, this was already mentioned, that European Parliament, as always, is more ambitious than the Commission. 55% of greenhouse emission reduction for 2030, and legally binding commitment on climate neutrality to 2050, and also that the target 55 should be endorsed before upcoming COP26 in November in Glasgow. So it's and also there was we read in this text this encouraged other non-EU countries, in particular major emitters, to do the same. So now we are confronted with the situation that we need actually for the need of a speedy revision of this what we have done before, and Parliament actually works all time on the new proposal, and there was not really assessment what we actually decided, because the time was very short, and now we are waiting actually for the what input of the Commission. Yeah, and in the going back to the resolution, I'll just say that there's also some paragraphs or some articles which we can agree. I can agree. For instance, the stress that should be comprehensive impact assessment, identifying social and economic costs. There's a lot also talk about energy poverty in European Parliament, especially on the left, but not only on the left part of the Parliament. There is a questions of competitiveness of the EU, of small and medium enterprises. It is also important that it is mentioned that we have in European Union very different regions, and the member states have a very different starting point. Yeah, and this is and what was actually in this neglected, also once mentioned, this is security of supply, and there is only one mention, the questions, what would be very probably one of the most controversial, also in today's exchange of opinion, Madame Simpson, this is the question of natural gas. What is position of my group? It's a conservative group, but we would like, as an integral conservatives, we like to protect, of course, environment, also our values and basic institution. We would like protect also human environment, not only nature, but we agree that there is a need of acting in the many fields, improving air quality and preserve ecosystem, better manage waste, and so on. We believe that we need coherent industrial policy, and now we are in this stage in which this very ambitious goal of the climate protection. Now we have to translate this in the kind of industrial policy. And now I think, after today having pressure, that many of my colleagues who were before very eager, for this setting goal, very ambitious, that now they are probably under pressure, now reflect, they have to go back to the people. We have more and more voices from the industry, for very different countries. We can read, for instance, 2 days ago, I read in the Frankfurter Allgemeine Zeitung that Germany cannot reach the CEER reduction goal, and probably in this year, and probably 2013, then European Environment Agency is saying that only 3 countries probably will achieve what we decided before Green Deal. So this is, I think, this is very, there would be very important questions as we have many meetings and so on. My group believes that a plan to increase the EU greenhouse gas emission reduction target to at least 50% and possibly even 55%, as we know, will require an unprecedented financial investment and changes to economic models that will benefit higher income member states, possibly at the expense of poorer member states that still largely depend on cohesion policy funding. So this, I think that we sometimes, I am now a politician and now I'm a social scientist, but if you are talking about climate and Green Deal, we sometimes do not think enough about political impact of this. Yeah. Growing differences between member states, the questions of some regions, and this is why, of course, there is this just transformation fund, but there's the questions if it is enough. We are also opinion, my group, that natural gas is very, very important in decarbonizing of economy, decarbonization of economy, and this is a bridge fuel. And we also are not against this, that the nationally determined contribution should be raised. So this is what I have to report, and now the situation today, according to me, maybe I'm wrong, but as I said, also in the discussion in voting PCIs yesterday and today with the exchange with Commissioner Madam Simpson, I had the impression that now we are in the next stage, or the next phase, in which now we have to think very carefully what is achievable and what is acceptable by our voters, by the member states from which we are, what is possible for industry, and I think this brings a little more probably realistic assessment of this proposal. I have the impression that some of my colleagues became a little more cautious, but of course we are waiting now for the proposals of Commission, and we will start to work on it. And I hope on your cooperation, on your competences, and because without these competences and without your help, of course, no legislative act could be really good, sound, and for benefit of, just to remember, as a clean energy package was clean energy for all Europeans. Yeah, we should always think that it should be for all Europeans. It's our duty not to leave anybody behind. No country, no region, and no the people, that I wouldn't like to be, in the couple of years to hear from some region that there are some people who are not such be able to heating the houses. Yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you very much for those insights from the Parliament, from your group, and I think above all from yourself as a politician. And indeed, this is at the end of the day a very political question, and it's very useful to hear, I think, to hear your perspective on this. I won't keep you any longer. This is to say there's a coffee break now, and we're going to reconvene at 11:30 sharp, so that gives you a good 10-15 minutes for coffee. And I'll hand over at this point. This is goodbye from me. The moderation then will be taken over by Anne Vadez-Nielsen, Vice President at CEER. So I wish you an enjoyable afternoon. Thank you very much. Okay, they don't know where they're sitting.
Please take your seats. We're about to begin.
Who's doing the Twitter?
I think it's Una and Liselotte. Please take your seats. We're about to begin.
Good job.
Oh, thanks. Yeah. We're about to begin. Please take your seats.
Yes, let's get started. And I see some people standing in the back. There are a lot of seats here in the front, so please, you can sit. And don't bother if it says reserved, because now all the speakers are either here or are already sitting. So please, come. So welcome back from the coffee break, and also from the interesting session, the session before, that was more on the whole system approach. A system of a system, I've learned, and how can this contribute to the transition? This was very interesting, but also very, very overarching. I think now we are going to dive more into the very, very interesting topic on how consumers can contribute to the transition, to decarbonization, and how they can be empowered, but also, of course, how we can achieve this transition with empowered consumer at the least cost. I think that's very important. That was something that the MEP that spoke before here stressed, that we don't want some consumers to be left behind. It's it's all Europeans that has to be on board. So this is, of course, a challenge, I would say. Before we are going to hear from our panel, which they are already here on the stage, and I will introduce them in a while, we will listen to a keynote speech from MEP Ville Niinistö. You can take a stand, Ville. Ville is representing the Greens, and you're also a member of the ITRE committee. And Ville, we are, of course, all very interested on this Green Deal. What does it mean? We have seen some communications, but what does it mean in practice? And we are very, of course, interested to hear your perspectives on how to get the consumers on board in this great transition. So, Ville, the floor is yours. And Ville has to leave after a bit after his speech, but he has agreed to take some questions after the speech, so you are able to do that. So, and you heard before how to do it, so be prepared with the mic if you want to make a question. Yes, please, Ville.
Thank you, Chair. It's a pleasure for me to be here this afternoon and discuss the huge challenges and opportunities that we have ahead of us with the Green Deal and energy transition, and especially now focusing on the consumer side of that, which is obviously you who work in the regulatory field. The field is in a huge change, like in this room. Everybody here is an actor who decides where you sit, and we are not totally balanced. There's more room here and less room back there. So we are moving into an energy system where we have more and more producers. It's not just consumers anymore who just use energy and electricity, but we have hundreds and hundreds of thousands active actors in the energy market who are also producing energy. So everything is changing in that sense, and it's not always easy for the regulators, but also this is at the same time a big possibility for making a cost-effective transition that we take the consumers on board. So I will focus on that, but I will start by saying a few words about the ambition levels and how Parliament and we Greens see that. The European Parliament just had a resolution on the Green Deal, and the Commission is now looking at the 50-55% emission reduction. Like my colleague Krasnodebski previously said, that Parliament is pushing for at least a 55% reduction, and also addressing that there should be also national targets for renewables and energy efficiency, and those targets should also be addressed very soon. So if we will raise our ambition level to 2030 to those even to those levels, 55%, which is not even in line with Paris targets. If we would like to be properly in line with the climate ambition of 1.5 degrees, then we should look at 60% or 65%. But let's assume that we would get it at least the 55% target as the EU goal this spring and summer. That would mean such a drastic scale up of investment in renewables, also looking at sector coupling and also looking at energy efficiency in a way which means that we have to be more systemic in our approaches, not just, you know, the national climate and emission plans have been quite loose, so we have to look at how EU can make this transition faster and more coherent. So we have to look at ETS, we have to look at a lot of energy taxation directive, we'll have to look at the revision of RED II, EED, EBBD, in order to align those with these climate commitments. So there will be a lot of focus in the next year on addressing a new level of ambition and then implementing it. Obviously, at the same time, even current decisions need to be implemented, and we still are lagging behind, especially in the current energy efficiency targets and renewables targets. And all of this means a massive investment in the energy system. So if you look at, I understand earlier you discussed about sector coupling, and that's a big part of the discussion, that what kind of investments we should do at an EU level, what investments will make the transformation and transition as efficient as possible, as cost effective as possible, good for European technology, good for European industries and companies, good for consumers, good also for electricity pricing. There's a lot of factors that we have to take into account. And one of them is obviously enabling and empowering consumers. On the political level, we should talk about citizens and not just consumers. We speak about prosumers, consumers that are producers. We speak about self-producers, citizens' energy communities, citizens that actively participate in the market. And what politicians and regulators need to do, we need to create an enabling framework for citizen involvement in energy market. It's key that citizens have easy access to technical and financial advice, certified professionals and proper incentives to make millions of individual projects reality. All barriers need to be addressed, and we need also nationally binding targets and targeted financing schemes. If you look at, for example, renovations, there is a big investment needed, and a lot of that is based on households. A number of European countries has an energy system where the heating is based on households, so that system has to be changed and transitioned. So the investment numbers are high, and the political guidance needed for that to be as cost-effective, but at the same time climate-wise ambitious as possible will be a big task where we'll need also your input how to do that most effectively. The Just Transition Fund is the most concrete part of the Invest EU program so far, and it's only 7.5 billion for the next 7 years. That's what the Commission says is fresh money, but it's still, obviously, that's only a small amount of the total investments needed. Commission is speaking about an investments in the level of €1 trillion, and that means that this has to be channeled, the rest of the money nationally and from the private sector. And obviously we are just talking about the next 7 years MFF as well to make sure that Europe can invest in this. Obviously there will be a lot of need also from the consumers' viewpoint, a lot of investments into the electricity grids to make the transformation as smooth as possible and that we can actually use electricity effectively all across Europe. But essentially, I would like to emphasize that addressing climate change is still an issue of will. We have technologies in Europe, we have knowledge, we have both understanding of how we can create the energy transformation, and basically there is cheap money available for investments, but it's a question of political will, and it's a question of creating the right incentives for companies and individuals to take part of that change. And that's something where we all need to look together at how this can be realized. When it comes to the country level, countries need to ensure a stable environment for citizen participation. We cannot change support schemes retroactively or suddenly stop them in the middle of them being implemented. This has slowed down development of renewables in a number of countries. And if you look at the scale of if we would want to use green gases more in the future, like hydrogen, it needs to be produced by renewables, and that means even more renewables. And now we are having a fall down of level of investments in renewables in a number of countries like Germany. So this has to be looked at how we can actually make sure that these investments go forward. So we will need also investment security also for citizens and small-scale investments of these solutions. So this week in the Petitions Committee in the European Parliament, there was, for example, a petitioner from Bulgaria that argued the sudden reduction of distributed renewable support, mainly for solar panels, was stopped in Bulgaria after the country reached its renewables targets for 2020. So obviously from the citizens' viewpoint, this kind of political decision-making, which is tumultuous, is very difficult for doing the investments on renewables. Secondly, the decarbonization technologies exist for all sectors. We just need to roll them out and provide an atmosphere where this is beneficial for the consumers. One thing we need to look at is smart meters, which are possible that in many ways the consumers can time their energy-intensive activities to when electricity is greener and the pricing is lower. And there is a link to digitalization here, obviously, that this kind of technologies needs to be rolled out. And I think this kind of flexibility in consumer pricing and real-time pricing can also be part of addressing the production volatilities that will also be a part of a renewables-based energy system to make sure that we get actually the most out of the energy investments we do by getting a lower price by taking the consumers on board in this. Energy storage in different forms in households and centralized is part of the transition. This has to be made possible that citizens can be part of energy storage solutions. Then other technologies than electricity, like district heating, is becoming more and more market-based, and even smaller actors can be a part of a district heating system as producers as well. And there we can also find ways of storing energy, like in Helsinki, the energy company has a plan to use the caverns underneath Helsinki as energy storage for heat. Electric vehicles obviously are more and more available, and that's a way for consumers to be a part of this change, how the public sector can create an infrastructure which functions and makes the transition as fast as possible and smooth as possible. So the market needs to be there too also for the citizens led solutions, and they need to be provided access to balancing markets. They need to have the right to choose if they connect the grids, and the grid fees need to be reasonable. This is also an issue which I often get response from consumers that it's still difficult to feed into the grid if you're a small-scale producer, and there are varying conditions in a number of countries. Basically, this is the backdrop to the big challenge we have ahead of us. But my final message is that we as Europe, we as industries in Europe, we as politicians in Europe, we as societies, we will benefit from an ambitious climate policy, obviously by saving our planet, but also if we do it in a way which is coherent, we take into use European technology, make it more cost efficient, and we are part of a solution and leaders globally in also selling that knowledge abroad. So this should be seen as a joint task where we all are actors and we all are playing together to make sure that this Green Deal is a big European industrial revolution and a possibility for a new kind of an economy and green growth for Europe. Thank you, and I guess the panel will continue from this.
Thank you, Ville. Very interesting. Are there any questions from the floor to Ville? No, crystal clear. There's a lot of things we have to do, but thank you so much for framing this discussion. And once again, thank you. Okay, we will now move to our distinguished panel, and I will introduce them a little bit to you. First here, we have Katarina Sikov-Magni. Katarina is head of unit for the retail market in DG Ener, and you are also now acting director for the internal energy market. So 2 jobs, but I'm happy that you are here still. Then we have Paul Voss. You are managing director of Euroheat and Power. So we heard already mentioning district heat. That's an interesting angle as well. Then Monica de Volder. Monica, you are economic officer and you are also team leader for energy within BEUC. So welcome, Monica. And last but not least, we have Luis Munuera. Sorry. You work for the IEA, where you are smart grids lead and within the energy technology policy division. So a very we have many perspectives here, I hope, and to try to discuss this quite tough and hard path, maybe, for consumers, both in the context of financially, but also, of course, to find this interesting, because we know from many surveys that we are done that consumers are not particularly interested in energy. Sorry, we in this room, we are energy nerds, but consumers are not. And how can we work the appetite? Because we need the consumers, I think, and the consumers need to participate in this transition. So, Katarina, we will start with you, and you will give an intervention, and then we move on, and then you can, of course, ask each other questions, and I hope for a good discussion, and then we will finally take also questions from the floor. But Katarina, as we talked, we said that this decarbonization policy will, of course, lead to this phasing out of the fossil fuels and other fuels coming in. This will have the financial implications, as we said. Is the Just Transition Fund too little? We heard from the MEP Niinistö, maybe not, I don't know. And what about energy efficiency? I hope you can shed some light over those questions. So the floor is yours, Katarina.
Thank you very much, Anne, and good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I'm very pleased to be here today to share with you the discussion on consumers, on the energy transition, decarbonization, and the challenges and opportunities we are facing. I would start by saying that the clean energy package that was adopted recently is the prime tool to ensure that we can deliver decarbonization first by 2030 objectives, and then in the longer term by 2050, taking into account, of course, that we are now discussing increasing the ambition. But that is the tool that is Europe's answer to how to make the market work properly, how to minimize costs, how to incentivize action, be it by households, by businesses, or by investors, etc. So the clean energy package provides the legal framework within which we can operate and we can bring the change to the market and to our homes. The package puts consumer in the center of the energy transition. What does it mean? You know, does every citizen know that they are now in the center of this whole system? I'm not sure. We know it. Well, first, of course, there are a number of rights that the consumers, every citizen now have, thanks to the package. Anybody who has the willingness, the means, the interest can become a producer, can, when technology evolves a little bit more, can also be a storage, offer storage services. Everybody has the right to request a smart meter that allows them to take part actively in the market. The consumers, citizens can also now form citizen energy communities or renewable energy communities. This is a new way of sharing economy in the energy sector. Of course, we know that member states are currently transposing these legal rules into practice, but we also know that there are already a lot of interest to test these new tools and bring the possibility for using my solar panels, and if I don't need that energy during the day, maybe my neighbor does. So instead of going to the grid, maybe the neighborhood can organize itself in the best way. Digitalization, which was also mentioned by MEP Niinistö, is an enabling tool that helps bring data, knowledge and information into the system, so very important. But we must be sure then that everybody is on board, be they young or old, live they in cities or in remote areas, are they owners of their flats or renting their houses, are they rich or poorer, are they IT literate or not, so that everybody can take part in the way they want to take part. And this is, of course, the challenge. It requires raising awareness, talking with people directly on their fears, their concerns, and the opportunities they have. So at the same time, we must also ensure that nobody is left behind in the transition. So we must make it easy for the citizen, as easy as it is today using your mobile phone. We are not yet there in the energy sector. So we all have a role to play, whether we are policymakers, whether we are technicians, whether we are regulators. So we all need to contribute to this. I just then touch upon, before concluding, a couple of issues relating to financing on this. I mean, the big bulk of financing is, of course, with the private sector at national level. The EIB at the EU level is our prime partner, but the Commission also has some instruments that can be of direct benefit to citizens in the energy transition. First of all, the regional funds that have been there already for a long time. I mean, they are in the order of 300 billion, I think, overall, covering all member states, and they are not accessible, of course, directly to a citizen, but they can be pooled at the regional level in such a way that, just to give a couple of examples, that in 2016 already in Poland, the Ministry of Culture brought together 139 art schools into a project which then renovated these art schools, made them energy efficient using modern technologies, and thanks to that, their CO2 emissions were reduced by 73%. So these kind of possibilities were then direct subsidies from the regional funds, of course, helped get these projects ongoing. Just Transition Fund was already mentioned. That by no means will be the only instrument to finance the transition. There, of course, 7.5 billion would be a drop in the ocean. There, again, private sector, national budgets, regional funds, EIB, etc., will provide the big bulk of funding. The Just Transition Fund will focus in particular in those regions and areas, sectors, where there is a risk that there will be people left behind. Just one example. We have several regions where we still have coal mines operating. Many of the regions are ready and willing to close the coal mines, and we need to help them, the people there, the miners, to find new occupation, new jobs, be these then in renewables area or in other businesses, and these kind of investments could be leveraged by the Just Transition Fund. Also in those coal mining areas or areas which are highly dependent on carbon intensive industrial processes, renovating of the houses there to make them energy efficient could also be one of the type of investments. Then we also have in place an instrument called ELENA, which provides to municipalities and cities technical assistance to build projects for the transition. An example, again in Poland, in Krakow, the ELENA support was used to replace individual coal boilers with energy-efficient district heating systems in the city. In Picardy, in France, this support was used to provide a one-stop shop where any citizen could go to take a loan to make their houses or flats energy efficient. So these possibilities are there. They are to be then taken up by, in this case for ELENA, by cities and municipalities. And then the last example I have is the LIFE program, which has now also in our proposal for the new budget period 2021-27, we have proposed to beef it up. It has already helped regions to build transition roadmaps, to provide support again to local stakeholders in making ambitious transition to clean energy. So these just as a couple of examples. We could provide you with numerous other examples, but what is the important element is that none of these instruments alone will be enough. We need everybody, we need all of you, we need the regulators, because the transition will come up with new type of ways of producing electricity, energy in general. We are moving towards energy being a service. The role of transmission system operators, distribution system operators will change. The more we see energy, citizen energy communities in place, it will have an impact on how the grid also will operate, and we need to work on the interfaces. So the regulators will play a key role in this whole transition process, and regulators need to look at innovative regulatory approaches. I know that the word innovation is not always associated with regulators naturally, but that's why we also have CEER, which has been given the task to be forward-looking and come up with new ideas, having perhaps tested them at the local level somewhere. So we rely on all of you, and together we can make the transition a success. Thank you.
Thank you, Katarina. We will directly move to you, Paul, and for the perspective of heat. And heat accounts roughly for half of all energy use in Europe. So this is very important, of course, that we also focus on this when we are talking transition. And you will tell us more about your views on how Europe can do a better job on engaging customers and customers. I shouldn't say that. I've learned now, citizens, I should say, in the European heat transition. So the floor is yours.
Am I on? Yeah. Hi, everybody. Thank you. Am I? Yeah, I think so. Huh? Hi. Good afternoon. It's 12:03. Thank you, Anna. I'd like to start by saying a couple of really positive things about the European Commission. First of all, we've come a really long way over the last few years when it comes to talking about heat within the broader European energy policy debate. It's been about 5 years since I started doing this type of thing. And at the beginning, I was very, very frustrated because typically you'd begin a discussion which was ostensibly about energy policy, and within about 10 seconds, it would have narrowed to a discussion about electricity. And that's changing quickly because heat has been on the agenda these last years. I think it informed the work on the clean energy package, and I think it's helping to shape the foundations of the Green Deal. Second, the Commission's done, I think, a wonderful job the last 12 months in particular, and I think we'll do even more the next 6 months on pushing this topic of sector integration, which I think is important for heat and for the wider energy system, and in the end for consumers and citizens, because I think if we organize things properly, we can make this energy transition easier and cheaper and quicker than if we continue to see the energy system as a series of silos. Finally, it's really great that we're talking so much about consumers and citizens, because obviously they're going to have to be at the center of this if it's going to be acceptable to society in general. Now, having said that, maybe a couple of words about how difficult it is. I was invited maybe 6 months ago to a European conference abroad on putting citizens at the heart of the energy transition and so on, all about how to bring citizens along. And I went there and I was looking forward to meeting a citizen, but it was by invitation only, and there were a lot of police and some dogs, and I recognized pretty much everyone in the audience, and I did feel we probably could have just sat down in Brussels. And I don't mean that as a criticism, but rather as an illustration of how difficult it is to engage citizens. I don't know how many we have here. We did have some Fridays for Future kids in the room, which was great. But basically, it was a discussion for and among professional policy people, which is kind of normal and simply illustrates the scale of the challenge of trying to get people involved. Do people know they're anywhere near the center of the energy transition? Possibly not. I certainly don't think anyone's told my Auntie Audrey. But I think there's a way that we can at least take a step towards these people, and that's by trying to work more closely with local authorities. Of course, national governments are important, but when I've learned the most about what this stuff's like for ordinary people, it's when I've spent time with cities, with deputy mayors, with councillors in charge of sorting out the energy transition for the city of Rotterdam or Brussels or wherever. And of course, there you find a very different perspective, a very local and practical perspective on what this is like. I think at times here in Brussels, there is a tendency to naturally reach for solutions which are based on gas and electricity, because essentially, I mean, for a long time, that's been the job here, to regulate those markets. And that's perfectly normal and fine. But I do think sometimes it pushes us to focus perhaps too narrowly on what we can do with gas and electricity, when actually there are other solutions, including district heating, but also solutions we can find by connecting these different networks together. And I think having this more joined up governance where local voices are helping to shape European policy, and European policy is made in a way that helps support the ambitions of local decision makers, the whole thing will work better, and by extension, work better for citizens. And just one quick, very local example of a challenge in the heating sector. So we renovated our house last year. Top to bottom renovation of a house not far from here in Brussels. And I was determined to do something better than putting a fossil fuel boiler downstairs, because it seemed important to me and because I spent all day talking about these things. It was impossible. First of all, I struggled terribly just to find an installer who would even come and talk to me about something so outlandish. And when I finally had a guy come, he told me it would cost 23,000 euros to put a heat pump in the garden, which struck me as kind of a lot. But more seriously, I said to him, okay, well, fine, but we're going to live here for 20, 25 years. Talk to me about payback periods. And he laughed and said, no, you're going to spend more on the electricity than you would on the gas. So never mind the difference in the upfront costs. It's going to be progressively more expensive as time goes by. And that, that's a very practical problem for me as a citizen. And of course, now we have a giant gas boiler in my basement, and I look at it every day and see a market failure, and it frustrates me. And that's to do with tax conditions more than anything else, the way we deal with electricity and the way we deal with gas. There's nothing to tell people, stop burning fossil fuels for heat in your house. And until we can do something about that, it's going to be really problematic. And it's a very down-to-earth, practical concern for a citizen. And if it bothers me, and I'm obsessed with sustainable heat, how does a normal, healthy person feel about something like that? Of course, they just don't do it. My wife looked at me like I was crazy when I even brought it up, because she's a normal person and has common sense, and it's just too much. And so and none of this is meant as a criticism of the European Union, but only to illustrate the need to try and align what we say we want to do here at European level with the practical consequences of these policies at local level. And that means really a constant structured dialogue with cities, particularly on the question of heat, because it is inherently local. Even if it's connected to the wider European energy system and so on, there's still a heavy local dimension here. And local people need to feel that they're being understood and helping to influence the direction of policy. Thank you.
Thank you, Paul. Then we will move to Monica. Monica, we have a vision together with your organization in CEER, a vision for 2020. That's this year, but a vision for well-functioning markets where consumer actually can reap the benefits. And we have some principles in that vision, something we call the RASP principles. RASP being reliability, affordability, simplicity, and then, of course, that consumers should be protected and empowered. We took this vision, I think, 8 years ago. Can you try to talk about where we are with those principles? We heard from Paul that maybe the markets are not working that super well. And when we move into this new world with the transition where consumers should be more citizen-like and be more active and they can produce, don't we need the principles anymore, or have we already achieved them, or can you talk us through this?
Thank you, Anne. Thank you for having me here, and good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I will go to 2020 vision in a bit, but I really want to react to what Katharina and what Paul mentioned. I think the engagement, the consumer, citizen, how to get people in, or consumer buy-in also for the Green Deal, I think it's a tremendous task, and it's for local partners, but also for consumer organizations. Just to give you an example, our members, national consumer organizations, are, for instance, helping energy-poor consumers in Poland, thanks to Horizon 2020 project, or talking about solar panels. Some of our members are organizing collective purchases of solar panels, of pellet stoves. So I think there are different local partners, including also consumer organizations, and European funding is very important to that. Now to 2020 vision. I'm sure, because I see many familiar faces and organizations which actually signed up to this vision, which we did indeed with CEER 8 years ago. So this is a year of delivery in a way. So we are watching you, how this vision is going to be implemented or is implemented in your task. What I would like to say is that I'm quite optimistic in a shift of narrative, that those organizations, or in general, I see that there is a shift in narrative in the industry associations and also in companies. Just to give you an example, not that long time ago, we looked at flexible energy offers, and we contacted some innovative companies who offered these kind of offers, and we told them that maybe some of their contract terms and conditions could be improved. And some of them actually engaged in kind of constructive dialogue with us and promised to change their conditions. So I see that there is some willingness to cooperate and improve things. So there is a shift in the industry language and the narrative, but it's also about shift in the whole. Back in 2012, we were still based on third energy package. Now we have the clean energy package and looking ahead, the Green Deal. So there has been also a huge shift in policy. If you look at the Energy Union strategy, if you look at the clean energy package, we have for the first time a right to produce and sell electricity we produce at home. Of course, the legal certainty is very important, but the job is not done yet, and of course the implementation of the clean energy package is very important. Now, what I would like to say is that, of course, these vision, the principles, means reliability, affordability, simplicity, protection and empowerment are still very much valid. Because we still talk about energy, which is essential service, so affordable energy supply continues to be the main topic for many consumers. Simplicity, understandability, how easy it is for me to go for, to make easy choice to a better tariff. I think this will become even more important than ever, because as we know, the clean energy package is opening the door to new innovative services, be it aggregators offers or dynamic price contracts. So the question is, am I going to be able to compare, to actually understand what's on offer in the market so that I could go for it? So simplicity, very important principle. I think we also need to look at the main trends, decarbonization, digitalization, the whole digitalization process, how it actually is. What is the impact in the energy sector, be it also in terms of privacy, security, cybersecurity, connected devices, are they secure or not? Artificial intelligence, risk of price discrimination, what happens with the whole price, personalized pricing, what is the impact on different consumer groups? And of course, bundling, big issue, not only within telecommunication, what we have seen for many, many years, but across sectors. And this is, of course, calling for the cross-sectoral cooperation of different authorities. That's why BEUC has been so much supporting CEER initiative peer. Now also, when I mentioned the Green Deal, something about that, as BEUC, we very much welcome the Green Deal because it can make a large contribution to an ecological modernization of our societies, and it is a game changer. Now, how to get people on board, how to engage consumers, we must make sure that this transition is inclusive and fair for all consumers. If consumers, and this is the big thing, how to engage people. Because we've been talking for years about empowerment and engagement, and we still see that switching is, we celebrate basically when it's over 25%. That still means that 75% of the market is not switching. So how to engage? It needs to be as hassle-free as possible. Consumer engagement. It needs to be affordable, and it needs to be also a source of satisfaction. And that's why in the discussion on the Green Deal, we hope, or we want to promote first well-designed price signals. That means that the sustainable option should be an affordable one. We need fair distribution of costs of the climate transition, because in the first panel I heard a lot about investments, about money which will be needed into networks and infrastructure. So who is going to pay for that? Who is going to be the winner? Who is going to be the loser? We need clear information and protections. Just to give you an example, greenwashing. We need also better planning for transition. That means if we want to have more electric cars and clean transport, we also need to have infrastructure available, and we also need to have understandable tariffs so that people can really compare and understand what to choose. And last but not least, I think we need to have positive messaging, because the whole communication about climate crisis is very negative, understandably, because the scenarios are horrible. But from behavioral science, if you want to activate people, you need to give positive messaging. So that's it from me. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Monica. Last but not least, we have Louis here, and you are going to give us more sort of maybe the technical perspective. Because we know that the integration will, of course, bring about new technologies like smart grids, energy storage, demand-side response, but also a different kind of energy vectors that are not that present today, like hydrogen, for example. Are we really on track to increase the flexibility of the energy system? And there is also going to be a lot of devices maybe installed in our homes. Are we on track with that? So can you please try to shed some light on those issues?
Sure, thank you. So I'll start maybe with one of the outputs, the things that my organization is most famous for, which is its scenarios. So every year we produce a set of scenarios. Some of us show us, some of those scenarios show us where the world is going in a kind of business as usual case. And others are more like sustainable development scenarios where we say, okay, well, given all the objectives that we have around the world, in Europe, in other markets, where do we need to be in 2030, 2040, 2050, and so on. And one way that we use those scenarios is to say, okay, well, let's track a very large set of technologies. We look now almost at 50 different technologies, different areas of the transition, and how well are we doing in those areas, not only in terms of how many of these technologies are we deploying, what's the penetration, but also in terms of policy, regulatory frameworks, and so on, and also in terms of the development of those technologies, R&D, et cetera, et cetera. So when we look across the energy system, one of the areas that's lagging behind, particularly not on track with that transition, with that sustainable development scenario that we have at the IEA, is demand response. So around the world, we have around 50 gigawatts altogether of demand response, which by our count is less than 5% of all the flexibility that's available today, or that's in use today. It's very localized in different markets. US is definitely in the lead, and there's other geographies as well. Something that's quite relevant for consumers is that we need to be quite smart about how we're deploying that demand response. So what we're seeing is that there's a vast amount of flexibility that can be tapped, quite kind of low-hanging fruit, that we don't actually need those kind of complex, highly complex arrangements with consumers, particularly in the residential sector. And we've seen, some very innovative ways of doing that whenever those consumers have been connected. Let's say the providers of flexibility have been connected with the consumers of that flexibility. So in practice, what does that mean? How is that achieved? So many points have already been made in terms of these RASP principles around simplicity, affordability, and so on. Maybe I'll just add a couple from our side in terms of what we see is maybe needed to increase the penetration of demand response. So the benefits for consumers need to be very clear and they to be very measurable. So that's an area that I think both in terms of communication, in terms of awareness, and in terms of the design of programs needs definitely more focus. And maybe the second aspect I'll highlight there is that rules need to ensure that consumers stay in control of their involvement. They need to understand the benefits, but they also need to understand the responsibilities. And finally, maybe to say that inclusiveness is an aspect that I think Monica has already alluded to. But these kind of mechanisms, they need to be inclusive of all consumers, and they need to protect also to some degree certain groups of consumers. So maybe moving on to a second technology that I've been asked about, which is energy storage. Of course, this is always on the headlines, especially in the European debate. There we assess that it's actually on track with the transition. But there we see that the focus needs to move from incentivizing individual technologies, batteries, other technologies, and so on, to a broader conversation around flexibility services, markets, applications, and so on. So last year, so let's say 2018, that was a record year in terms of deployment of storage. So installations doubled from one year to the next. And there were some markets where overnight they were created very quickly and they almost overheated with how fast storage was being installed. 2019 is just finished. The data that we have provisionally says that it's going to be another record year. And maybe one of the most interesting trends there is that behind the meter storage is now 50% of all the storage that's installed around the world. Now, what we're seeing is that behind-the-meter storage is being deployed even when the economic case is not that interesting. So even when it doesn't make sense. This is happening in many, many countries. And also for grid-scale storage, we're seeing that from a cost-optimal perspective, maybe where it's being deployed in some applications is maybe not the cost-optimal case. But there we see some trade-offs between finding the very cost-optimal way and deploying storage quickly if one of the objectives is to do the transition faster. Then what I mentioned in the beginning, that we need to move the conversation from individual technologies or creating programs that spur one particular technology to flexibility services, applications, markets, and so on. So what we see in the pipeline, for example, some traditional flexibility resources that are kind of a little bit forgotten right now. There's a lot of that coming online. For example, pumped hydro, which is a very traditional technology. There's a lot of flexibility that can be tapped there. It's upstream, so it doesn't involve consumers very directly. But we see as much pumped hydro being deployed as batteries over the next 5 years. And then after that, batteries would definitely take over. But yeah, there's more a message to say, we shouldn't necessarily have that very kind of single technology or single solution focus. And then a final aspect I'd like to focus on is on smart grids or smartening the grid, digital grids, whatever term is more appropriate here. Overall, there we see that the digitalization of grids is happening slower than what we would need. So according to our numbers, we still see, of course, grid investment is dominated by traditional expansion of transmission and distribution networks. The share of investment in digital grid infrastructure has been very slowly increasing since 2012, and now it's around 8% of all the investment happening around the world. What we see is that the process is a lot slower than in other sectors, and even within the energy sector, grids are definitely digitalizing slower than some of the other sectors. So even when we look upstream, power generation, all the solutions are happening there in terms of virtual power plants, digital twins, and so on. And further upstream, even extraction, transport of fossil fuels, that's really digitalizing a lot faster than grids. There we see a number of challenges that still exist, and maybe not all of them are, even though of course regulation and policy has a big role to play, but there are also some technical challenges that remain, and there are some transition challenges that are really, really key. So maybe I'll just highlight a couple there. The first one is, I believe we need a more holistic architecture for the whole system. We've been talking about sector coupling, but what are those hotspots and around the system where that coupling is going to happen, and what does that architecture look like? And by architecture, I also mean including the ICT sector. So I think in general in the energy sector, we don't have we could have a better understanding of the ICT technologies, the consequences of their adoption, issues around data privacy, security, and so on. This is a very long debate, but still I think there's more improvement that can be done there. And then finally, an aspect that we're really doing a lot of focus on now, we have a big program that's being launched to try to accelerate this particular issue at the IEA, which is how do we accelerate and how do we make diffusions that are, to diffuse technologies that are happening at the local scale, how can we scale them up faster? There's been a lot of talk about regulatory sandboxes and kind of cordoning off areas of the system to test different technologies, different rules, and so on. And that's definitely a very sound approach. But we still don't have a very good sense of how do we actually scale those solutions from the small scale to actually deploying them very, very quickly. Even simple things like ways of purchasing technologies, it's not actually, those processes are not actually in place to really scale those technologies very quickly. So maybe I'll finish with that for now.
Thank you very much for the different views, and I open up now for you, panelists, to react on each other's interventions. So who would like to go first? Yeah, otherwise I have questions prepared. Okay, I'll start and maybe you get some ideas. I heard some very interesting things. I heard that, and many of you touched upon that, and also MEP Niinistö, that how can we really engage customers? Of course, all of us are customers, but we are maybe already, as I said, the nerdy ones and know a lot of stuff, but how can we reach ordinary people? Local authorities were mentioned over and over again, and I think this is interesting. And of course, Commission have a lot of good initiatives, but for me, I also wonder the role of the regulator here. Can we actually help local authorities, or can we push for those kind of initiatives? Because as you said, Monica, we need positive messages for the consumers, and maybe we reach them and can give those positive messages, not at the regulators, but locally, really locally. So Does anyone have any view on that, on how regulators can fit in this jigsaw puzzle of this local initiatives? Maybe from the Commission side.
Thanks. Maybe I could answer your question through examples, concrete examples. So we have been working now approximately 2 years with a number of European islands. And the islands, we have small islands, you know, with 100 people living on them, big islands, 5 million people living on them, connected islands with the electricity grid, non-connected islands, so a big variety of situations. But what is common to all of them is that they do want to become sustainable and have a decarbonized energy system in place. And we have been working together with them, now helping them prepare their plans, because they also have a question, of course, of in the small islands of what are their resources. I mean, they may have half a person dealing with energy, water, transport, you name it. So we are working together with them on plans, and then the next step is to see what are the obstacles in implementing the plans. And very often it comes to the question on, I mean, the energy systems, which is often based on diesel, is often paid by PSO, public service obligation, so socialized to other consumers. How can they have then an incentive, because they don't necessarily see the benefits of investing in a cleaner system if they already are subsidized for their high prices on that island? And I think that is a typical question where the regulator can come into the picture. And we have started working together with the regulators in order exactly to bring them on board and work together on such questions. So how to bring the incentive to the people on the island so that they can do what they want to do and they see the difference in their energy bills or similar. So that's a very concrete, we can get really to the people. They are very keen to work on this. And from there, the message will then spread to, we are starting with 30 islands, then the message will go to other islands, and hopefully one day we have covered all the couple of thousand islands we have in Europe where the situation remains like this. So just from us, it is very much through the concrete implementation of our tools that we have, be they legal tools, regulatory tools, or other tools, going on the ground and then bringing the relevant knowledge there. And the regulators there, as I mentioned, are key for the success.
Thank you. That's a good, very concrete example. I like these concrete things because I think we need that in order for this sort of maybe fluffy visions that we want the consumers on board and they are in the center to get down to some real actions. And I guess real action is also energy efficiency measures. It was touched upon, but very briefly. And this is, of course, very interesting. In some member states, there has been a lot of things done, but others may be lagging behind. Do we have some, and also the way how to do it? Should we have, and how to incentivize landlords, tenants, and also how to do it? Do we have some good examples? Do you know that, Monica, if we have some good examples throughout the EU on how this can be done so that this is, I mean, very, very interesting, I guess, for the consumer as well. So it's maybe worth to work more on this in order to get consumers on board to do even more advanced stuff.
Indeed, actually, when we look at, when we discussed recently with our members the main priorities of BEUC for the Green Deal, sustainable housing and energy efficiency including will be one of our main priorities together with sustainable transport, sustainable financing and sustainable food for the Green Deal. So, of course, the energy efficiency, probably when we talked about investments in the first panel, I don't know if these already include the potential of energy efficiency or take energy efficiency as infrastructure priority. that could be, I didn't hear energy efficiency that much in the first panel, I must say. Of course, we are looking, I mentioned one of the projects we are working on together with our members. It's a very practical project. It looks at energy, or it's about advising, or reaching out to energy poor consumers in countries like Poland, Slovakia, Lithuania, Latvia, Bulgaria, and some others. And trying, first of all, reaching out to those consumers is already quite a task, because nobody will tell you, I'm energy poor, I need your help. You need to really communicate, and the messaging is, again, very important here. And we look at low or no cost energy efficiency measures, because, of course, there are possibilities on that level, and then there are many question marks indeed about how to incentivize renovations, and the landlord-tenant dilemma or problem is, of course, a very important one. We can think of, this is something we are discussing also with our members, about what is the role of tax or fiscal policies in this area, and also another possibility, introducing, for instance, minimum building standards. You have example when you want to rent, your apartment, it needs to be at a certain level. You cannot rent, for instance, apartment which has EPCE, for instance, the Energy Performance Certificate E-level. So these kind of incentives or these kind of rules can, I think, help. But as I said, we are looking into it. What are the possible schemes? If you look outside, if you look at landlords, then of course you have, for instance, Pay As You Save scheme, famous Energiesprong project in the Netherlands. So I think there are examples. It's more a question how to bring them on the bigger scale, or how to have them on the bigger scale.
Thank you, Monica. Demand-side response. We heard that this is not on track, Luis. That sounds, wasn't surprising to me. On the other hand, it's a bit disappointing, because we know that there are some really low-hanging fruits. I know that from my own authority. I'm heading the Swedish energy regulator. And we know that there is a big potential, especially in heat. A lot of Swedes heat through heat pumps with electricity, not with gas, but still. And they can really contribute also, actually, without feeling any change in comfort. But there are barriers, of course, and also for other smart technologies. And we have a system with regulation that is very capex biased. It actually is very biased towards the companies, the network companies doing investing in copper. And this was how this was traditionally done. But what are the barriers, and how can we as regulators maybe trying to break up this bias that we have in our regulation, Luis? Do you have any good ideas on this?
Yes, thank you. So yeah, it's definitely true. We're already seeing in some jurisdictions where DSOs are sometimes seeing that traditional network reinforcement is becoming too costly, and they're resorting or planning to use flexibility to avoid or defer network investments. I mean, as a first step, it sounds pretty basic, but for flexibility to be able to participate across the energy system, it's just to accept flexibility resources in the full range of markets on an equal basis with existing resources, with incumbent resources. That doesn't happen very often, but when we've seen it, like when the playing field is even, when those providers of flexibility are connected with consumers of flexibility in an efficient way, we've seen, as I mentioned earlier, like very innovative resources, very low-hanging fruits happening there that maybe are not that intuitive. Things like electricity use in municipal services, waste heat being used from electricity infrastructure that's actually being put to very good use, and that also gives some flexibility there. This may include further enabling or enhancing the role of aggregators, but it's perhaps a separate debate. Another aspect there, which I think is very important, is to have just better economic modeling of network investments, where we can really very clearly, very transparently compare standard versus smart investments. So that includes a very solid understanding of ICT costs. That's a point that I'm making again now, but we've seen from pilot projects that the economics can be make or break, depending on what the ICT infrastructure cost is. And again, we still don't have a very, very good understanding of that. And also these models, these economic models for investment in networks, they need to have a very long-term horizon. We need to be talking about 2050, 2060, and so on. If there is any value to be had from investments where we're going to get a lot of the value further down the line and not very right away. Then another important aspect there, demand response, investments that are smart on the grid. There's often trade-offs between investing to, for example, alleviate the network constraint that you were mentioning because of peak load, and then actually trying to reduce losses on the network. So many of these measures that we're talking about could actually increase losses on the network. And so there's something like a caution as well for regulators to be able to strike a good balance between those kind of investments for the network. And then finally, maybe to highlight, we need to have better, well-defined, appropriate measurement, verification protocols for flexibility if we want to have very well-coordinated markets. So that is especially important for demand response, but even more broadly for any flexibility measures. We have to have very good baseline methodologies for what's actually the flexibility being provided. In the absence of that flexibility, what would the cost have been, and so on. So, maybe I'll leave the question at that. Yeah.
Thank you so much. Thank you for the advices. We are running a bit short here on time, I'm afraid, so we don't have the possibility for you in the audience to ask any questions. But Paul, I want to hear from you finally. You have heard the others, and we've heard more and more talk about heat as a potential here, and something to work with, both in relation to demand-side response, but also as sort of part of the transition. So any final words in relation to what you have heard from your fellow panelists?
Well, I heard a lot of good sense. But I think in the end, this heat thing, as I said, a few years ago, I used to find this really frustrating because I felt like we were bringing up this kind of weird niche topic. And actually, if any normal person looks at their energy consumption and their bills over the course of the year, they'll find that heat's a really big part of this. And it's also a very big part of the emissions profile. So if you want a decarbonized European energy system, you've got to have a decarbonized heat sector. The current situation is that it's dominated by oil and gas, and that's got to change. I think for the overall system, my experience has been that when you start to look for opportunities to link thermal, electric, and gas grids, the whole thing gets easier. Heat can contribute not only by supplying decarbonized energy to buildings, but also by helping with the integration of electricity, by offering balancing and storage services to the grid. So the whole thing works. And I know I spoke earlier about the importance of hearing local voices, but equally, Europe has a huge responsibility and a huge opportunity to make this happen. And I think the Green Deal and the launch of the discussion around sector integration is a perfect time to deliver that. So we're positive and optimistic, and yeah, thanks.
Thank you so much, and I think that's a good sort of way to end this panel, that we need to be optimistic. And I also heard from Monica, you said that the narrative has actually shifted. It has changed. So we have some stepping stone and some platforms with the Clean Energy Package and now with the Green Deal. So with those words, I will thank all the panelists, and we'll give them a big round of applause. And Annegret?
Yeah.
Now we have a special speaker. I'm very glad to welcome Mrs. Jorgensen and, of course, Florian to give us now the keynote. Very glad that you could make it in the end.
Thank you very much, Anne-Grete. And let me start by bringing greetings from Commissioner Kadri Simpson, who expresses her deep regrets that she's not able to be here today to speak to you and to meet you. She had been looking forward to this opportunity, but now we'll be looking forward to the next opportunity, hopefully in a not too distant future, to engage with you. But her loss is my gain, so to say, so I'm very happy to be here to meet you today and have this opportunity to speak to you and tell you where we are in relation to the energy aspects of the Green Deal and the role of regulators and regulation in that context. So it will not have passed any of you by that just 10 days after having taken office, the Ursula von der Leyen Commission with Executive Vice President Timmermans in the lead and working together with Energy Commissioner Kadri Simpson, adopted the Green Deal in December, which sets out an agenda going across all sectors of the economy and of our society of how to reach a climate neutral Europe in 2050. And of course, energy is absolutely central to this agenda, given the fact that 75% of our greenhouse gas emissions come from energy, either energy production or energy consumption. I want to underline that the Green Deal has as its primary objective to achieve climate neutrality, but it has also as an objective to make sure that we do that in a way where we remain competitive, where we are cost effective, we apply the most cost effective solutions, where we continue to have energy security and security of supply, and where we ensure that all consumers, all users are integrated into the transition and are not harmed by the transition. And so in other words, it is a green and climate neutral agenda, but it is also very much an agenda for European competitiveness, for energy security, for cost effectiveness, for growth and jobs. And I think it's important that that broader view of the Green Deal is clear out there. I would also like, before I get into more of the details on the Green Deal, to underline the important role of regulators and regulatory authorities in achieving the objectives of the Green Deal. And here today that applies both to the Agency for the Cooperation of Energy Regulators, to ACER, but also very much to the Council of European Energy Regulators. So it's a very good opportunity. I think we can all agree that we need more integrated and deepened energy markets as a necessary foundation for decarbonizing our economy and our energy sector. And we need more integrated markets, both because that will make it easier to bring the higher share of renewable energy into our electricity system, which is a necessary part of decarbonizing. And it will reduce the need for fossil fuel-based backup solutions and capacity mechanisms and others. So a need for integrated and deepened markets, of course, also necessary because this will allow the more functioning markets will make it easier for us to achieve the objectives of decarbonization in a cost-effective way. And as I said in my introduction, cost effectiveness is another overriding objective and principle. The Commissioner herself, in setting out the energy aspects of the Green Deal, has structured this around three key elements or guiding considerations, and I'm going to do the same today, relying on her reflections and her political presentation. Three pillars of people, European citizens and European consumers, our planet, how do we make sure that we have a green transition, that we remain sustainable, and then partnerships, how do we work with other parts of the world to make sure that we are not the only ones undergoing a green transition, because we only represent 9% of global greenhouse gas emissions. So we're going to need a lot more countries and regions of the world to engage in the climate transition. The first pillar, people, means that we need all consumers, all households, all small and medium-sized enterprises, all industry to be able to benefit from the transition to clean, affordable and secure energy. As I said, it means that we need to keep costs as low as possible. We need to make sure that we arrive at the most cost-effective solutions. What we're currently doing in our internal and preparatory work is to carry out modelling work and impact assessments of how do we reach the targets that have been tentatively set for 2030, and how do we reach the agreed target of climate neutrality for 2050 in the most cost-effective way? What does it require us to do in the coming years, and how do we best set the right foundation for that? In that context, I think it's important to underline that the best foundation for everything we're going to do is the Energy Union, the Clean Energy for All package, the electricity market design, and all the good work that has been carried out over the last 5 years, or has been adopted over the last 5 years, and that is now being applied out there, and on which we need to work with you, the regulators, and we need to work with markets, the transmission systems, and the distribution systems. But we have a very strong foundation, so it is not it is not a completely new agenda. We're not starting from scratch. We're not going to go back and revise everything that has just been adopted. We've got the strongest foundation possible, and the question now is, how do we take it one step further? A key component of that is, of course, our legislation on electricity market design. We've got the electricity regulation that has entered into force, and we've got the directive where member states will have to transpose it into their national legislation this year. I would like to point out some of the key elements in electricity market design that we see as particularly important for the Green Deal and the green transition that we are embarking upon. Now, first of all, as I've mentioned before, part of a green transition is to make room for and make it possible to have a higher share of renewable electricity in our overall energy mix and in our electricity mix. The variability of renewables can be a challenge in the system, and what we try to do in the electricity legislation is to accommodate larger shares of variable renewables, for example, through shorter trading times as one of the measures. So we'll continue to work towards that integration of renewable electricity into the system. Then we need to make sure, second point is we need to make sure that we can integrate this renewable energy into the overall general market framework, in particular by limiting the derogations that are there. Renewables are becoming central to our electricity system, and so we have to stop treating it as an exemption or something particular. This is the new electricity system, and we need to make sure that the general market adapts to that and caters for that. The third point is, of course, our European market, the integration of our markets. We need to make sure that electricity can flow across borders. We need to strengthen the market integration, and again, to make sure that we use the most cost-efficient and least polluting electricity that is out there. We've come a long way over the last years, but some regions of Europe are seeing a higher level of integration, a higher level of interconnectedness than others, and so there's still a lot of work to do on the aspect of across-border flow, in implementing the regulation and in transposing the directive to get there. So regional cooperation, and that's my fourth point, is another important aspect of that. Again, we have seen very good progress in regional cooperation, but some regions are further ahead, and hopefully the lessons learned from the regions that are furthest ahead in cooperating on renewable energy, for example, some of those lessons can also be useful for other regions, and they embark on the transition towards more renewable energy. The fifth point I would like to point out is, of course, capacity mechanisms, where the new rules we have give us a stronger regulatory framework for making sure that there are no capacity mechanisms out there that could be avoided, so that we only have capacity mechanisms when they're absolutely necessary, and to ensure that we address the security of supply by implementing the markets reform, and again, as I said, improving the regional cooperation. The last point I would like to make in relation to electricity market design is the people point of how do we best empower our consumers, our users, both individuals and industry. Addressing the high energy prices through price regulation has been tempting in the past, and we still see it in some parts of Europe, but that is obviously not the most cost-effective way to get there. And so we need to make sure that we lose the markets rather than market-distorting measures, and then we need to make sure that consumers have the right digital tools and the right technologies to become part of the transition and part of the better and more cost-effective markets than in the past. And the regulation and the directive together set the framework for that. And as I said, it's really part of now how is that transposed, and part of our collective role of making sure that these rules are applied and become effective throughout Europe. We have a lot of good work already done with you. both in terms of the implementation of the package, but also the network codes and the unbundling and all the other market rules. And so we look forward to working with you to take that further and to make sure that we get the right implementation. What I can assure you is that we as Commission services, but also my Commissioner and at the political level will stand by you and work with you to achieve these common objectives. As part of the consideration of how do our objectives include people and impact European consumers and citizens, I would like to also mention the aspect of energy poverty, which is a significant concern in many parts of Europe, not in all parts of Europe, but in many parts of Europe, and which is one of the issues that we want to address. We estimate that up to 50 million people in Europe are affected by energy poverty in the sense that they're not able to properly heat their homes. Energy efficiency is, of course, part of the answer to that. And so one of the initiatives that we are planning under the European Green Deal is a renovation wave. That's a highly ambitious objective we've set ourselves, but a renovation wave to make sure that more of Europe's housing and existing building mass can become more energy efficient and make it easier for people to heat their homes and become free of energy poverty. On energy efficiency, of course, household appliances and other appliances and technologies will be equally important, and so we will come out with a work program that is ambitious in terms of eco-design and eco-labeling, and what can we do to ensure the sustainability of products in our circular economy. So all of these aspects are also part of the Green Deal and part of the initiatives that we are preparing currently in DG Energy and together with our colleagues in other parts of the European Commission. My last point on people, on European citizens, is of course the just transition. The Commission has just adopted the just transition mechanism and related documents. This will now go to the co-legislators. It is a central part of the Green Deal because that is what we believe is needed to make sure that all regions of Europe have the possibility to engage in the transition, step away from carbon-intensive coal or other forms of fossil fuels into a greener technology, a greener energy-based, but doing it in a manner that does not leave anyone behind or risk the social structure and foundation in the different regions of Europe. And I think there it's important to underline that the starting point is very different. It's very different to make a green transition if you're in Copenhagen compared to if you're in Silesia, to make a very obvious example of the situations and how they are different. And so that are aspects that we need to integrate into our policy making and impact assessment. The second point is the planet, the health of our planet, and how we make sure that we set the framework for our energy system and our transition in energy to contribute to our climate targets, to align everything we do with the Paris objectives, and also more generally in a sustainable context. The President Ursula von der Leyen already in her political guidelines this summer set the objective of a climate neutral Europe in 2050, which has now been confirmed by the European Council in December. And she also set the objective that in order to get there, we should achieve a 50 to 55% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions in 2030. So we are currently carrying out the necessary assessments and modeling to see how do we get there in the most cost-effective way. How do we achieve these levels? I mentioned the decarbonization of the electricity sector, where we currently have 31% of electricity produced from renewable sources and more than half from low-carbon technologies, but we need to take that further. In order to get to the scaling up of the renewable energy and the renewable electricity as part of our overall mix, we believe that offshore energy is an absolutely essential part, also for questions of public acceptance and planning purposes. So we're looking at, or we're working on an initiative on offshore renewable energy, where obviously offshore wind is an important aspect of what needs to be scaled up and see further investments in Europe, together with further investment into grid and infrastructure to make sure that we also have the transmission and distribution systems in place there. Our analysis, our long-term strategy that was prepared in the last mandate of the Commission, and our analysis currently ongoing, shows that gas, which remains about a quarter of our total energy mix, will remain an important source of energy during the transition. And we need to look at how do we best integrate sectors, do sector coupling, look at how do we work between gas and electricity, which is quite a different way of working also for regulators compared to what we've done in the past. In order to get sector integration to accelerate and to contribute to the green transition and the lowering of greenhouse gas emissions, we are planning a strategy on sector integration later this year. This is, of course, not DG Energy and energy policy alone. We will be taking the process forward, but in doing that, we will be working very, very closely with other parts of Commission services and with other policy areas to try to bring it together on across a whole government approach to see how can sector integration contribute to, once again, the most cost-effective and flexible energy system at the, to achieve carbon neutrality. Gas, as I said, remains part of the transition. We need to look at how do we best decarbonize gas, how do we make more use of cleaner gas. So that's another part of the strategy. What we're also seeing, of course, is a shift from coal to natural gas, which represents a significant reduction in greenhouse gas emissions if we get it right. That requires us to address the methane leaks that are part of natural gas production, and so that's another issue that we're planning to take up together with Commissioner Simpson, coming out with an initiative on what can we do to reduce mineral methane leaks that occur in relation to natural gas production. I mentioned decarbonized gases, and so what we're also looking at as part of sector integration, or in the context of sector integration, is, of course, what do we do with, how do we arrive at a greater share of decarbonized gases, of biogas, and of hydrogen, scaling up investments in that and scaling up the contribution of those clean gases to our overall energy system. I mentioned infrastructure development, which remains a key component, and where we see that in many member states, investment into infrastructure and planning and permit processes are extremely complex, and we risk that that becomes an obstacle to the green transition and to the shift to a higher level of electricity and electrification of our energy system. And so in order to help further development of infrastructure and more investment in infrastructure, we also intend to review the 10E regulation so that the objectives of the regulation are clearly aligned with the Green Deal ambitions and objectives that we as a European Commission have set ourselves. The last point I wanted to make, as I said, is about partners, our international partners, because we cannot make the green transition alone, but we have learned a lot in what we have done over the last 5 years. And some of the elements of our electricity market design, for example, but also other regulatory frameworks, are relevant for our international partners. That, of course, is particularly relevant in the region, for the Western Balkans, for example, where we need to have a closer and more intense cooperation around the green transition and the shift in their electricity markets, and where we hope also for regulators to play a role, including ACER under the new electricity market design. It's also relevant beyond our neighborhood. It's relevant for our partnership with Africa. It's relevant for our engagement with China, which has shown a significant interest in electricity market design and the potential that gives also for the green transition and for the cost-effective approaches. Closer to home, there is, of course, cooperation with Norway, Iceland, and Liechtenstein that entered into force in September last year, that are also important components of what we do internationally and with partners. I also welcome the cooperation that CEER has with regulators from other European countries outside the European Union, and we hope that that can help those countries engage in the green transition and building the market foundation for that, not just in the EU, but also in neighbouring regions. So those were the 3 pillars that our Commissioner for Energy, Kadri Simpson, has set as part of the work on energy aspects of the green transition. And those were some of the some of the objectives, some of the planned initiatives that we are working on. And as I said, I hope that we can continue working closely with you, with regulators, with CER and ACER, each within your role, to overcome the barriers that are out there, to solve the problems, but also to harness the very significant potential of an integrated European-wide energy market, And I can say on behalf of Commissioner Kadri Simpson that she will be standing by you, as will I and my services, and look forward to working with you in this transition. Thank you very much for your time.
Yeah, many thanks, and indeed you took the words right out of my mouth. I don't need to say much, and I think we had a very, very lively and intensive debate today on a fascinating topic, and it also showed not only the interest, but also I think that we are at the beginning and the start of the discussion, as there are a lot of things now to implement, and of course starting with law proposals and then actually implementing it afterwards to have the change of the whole system as it was said today. And yes, we as energy regulators are very happy that the Commission and the institutions, the other institutions, do want to work with us. We are very eager to provide our expert advice on the upcoming legislative proposals on climate and sustainability issues. As energy regulators, we will be working on that also this year, as I said, and I think it is important here to work closely together to achieve this objective that we have, that is set now to become the first climate neutral continent. And as was also mentioned, the important thing is that this decarbonization happens at least cost, so that no one is left behind, as was said, and consumers do not pay excessive prices and bear an unfair burden or an unfair share of the necessary transition costs that this transformation will require. And of course, industry also must have, as was said by Clara this morning, the certainty for investments that they take into account in the future the necessary change in the energy mix with regard also to infrastructure investments. So I think that is important to say here as well. And to look at all energy, renewable energy possibilities in the future, including low carbon or gas or decarbonized gases, hydrogen and others, to optimize and also to optimize the use of sector coupling in order to change the energy system in the right direction. And I think it is also important, of course, to have at the same time not forget that this is, let's say, as also the proposal of the Green Deal made clear, that there is an industrial strategy and that this decarbonization is not made against the economy, and also, as was also mentioned, that we ensure security of supply in all of this, and a competitive internal market. And that is what we are working for as regulators as well. So with this, I think I close the conference, and I would like to thank all of you to have come to have attended the conference and also participated in the various Twitter questions. I don't know if there are any further results. No? Then I leave you now for lunch, and hope to see you again at another conference, maybe again here. Thank you very much.